Hey.
Wow, people really come and watch, huh? Um, I did a little interview. I'm not gonna dox myself, although I do constantly feel like I could. Ooh, if I just let go. Okay, so this contains graphic violent imagery. Frankie is beating up the door over there. Oh. So here's an idea I had. Here's a little idea. A little idea that I had. The audio is off. Okay, cool. This is everything that happened in 1991, I guess. But I thought it could maybe be fun to read a book out loud that I read recently. Aberration in the Heartland of the Real. The Secret Lives of Timothy McVeigh. You can see my book talk spawns type bookmarks in there, although they get cat hair on them pretty powerfully. Frank, you may leave. So I was going to read this book out loud. I've been meaning to. It'll take maybe 100 hours. I'm not the best out loud reader, but in the spirit of 1991, I was not yet formed at all. I was in the womb, not in the womb at all. I wasn't even implanted early on. That might surprise, but okay. So allow me to maybe put that in the title. Abbreviation of 2B, 1B and 2 R's. Let's remember that. And now, something that may actually be valuable is if I find a place for my microphone. That doesn't suck. And you can hear me and I can hold it. And I can look at my book. Maybe I can just do this. Oh, there's a lot of great quotes in here. She really is pretty heavy-handed with it. Okay. How has everyone been for the past hour? Are you the same people watching me? Or are you new people watching me? How do you feel about my bangs? They're in my eyes. Okay. I'm going to assume that my audio sounds good. And I'm not going to assume otherwise. So, let's see. It's turned up 400. Let's make that a 5. Then you can really hear my gristly old lady smoker's tone. Okay. Thank you. So this is from Don DeLillo Libra, 1988, this opening quote, which I was listening to on an audiobook and then stopped abruptly because I got kind of bored because I don't find Oswald to be a very interesting character. I just find him boring. I don't know. He's fine, but he doesn't think very hard. Sometimes he looked around him, horrified by the weight of it all, the career of paper. He sits in the data spew of hundreds of lives. There's no end in sight. Let's call a meeting to analyze the blur. Let's devote our lives to understanding this moment, separating the elements of each crowded second. We will build theories that gleam like jade idols, intriguing systems of assumption. We will follow the bullet trajectory backgrounds the bullet trajectory is backwards. We will follow the bullet trajectories backwards to the lives that occupy the shadows, actual men. There is much here in the aberration of the heartland of the real. On April 19th, 1995, at 9:02 a.m., A truck bomb exploded in front of the Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children. 2 days later, authorities named 27-year-old Timothy McVeigh as the prime suspect in the most deadly attack on American soil. They killed white people. Thereafter, his visage, quickly dubbed the face of terror, inundated the media, thus becoming seared into the archives of public memory. We got this great pic of him. In the immediate hours, weeks, and months after the explosion, a number of rapidly formed and highly conflicting narratives about both the bombing and the bomber appeared and spread. These stories developed over time and continue to circulate today. Their construction involves a complex and dynamic process of collaboration and competition between multiple individuals and institutions with various motives, agendas, and intents, stated or implied, all of whom assert different facts based on different evaluative criteria. Authors of the stories include journalists, victims and survivors, eyewitnesses and FBI, federal prosecutors, politicians, experts, analysts, pundits, defense attorneys, and notably McVeigh himself. Within each narrative, the material, facts, and chronology of events, as well as the roles and identities of the villains, differ, as do the acts attributed to them and their purported motives. Today, Timothy McVeigh, an American terrorist, all-American monster, and for a time the most hated man in America, that's my favorite 100 Gex song, continues to personify a wide range of prototypical Cold War and post-Cold War identities. A self-styled Rambo, survivalist, militia-type, gun nut, lone nut, disgruntled soldier, rogue avenger, boy next door gone bad, and quintessential conspiracy theorist termed rabid homegrown lone wolf domestic terrorist. Wow, say that 5 times fucking fast. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to stop apologizing because you're my bitch, not the other way around. Anyway, excuse me, please don't leave. Today, Timothy McVeigh, an American terrorist, all-American monster. Oh, wait, I already read that. Okay, blah, 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 face of terror. In McVeigh's Face of Terror is also reflected the ghost of Lee Harvey Oswald and, like Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, Sirhan, and a number of other American lone gunmen before and after McVeigh, all of whom inspired multiple competing, highly conflicting, and continually evolving narratives and debates about just how alone these lone wolves really were. Is Lone Wolf a real, are Lone Wolves really? Dr. Zhivago came out in 1981. Nice. Are there really wolves that are alone in nature? That's a question for you. Okay. Many of the narratives that appeared after McVeigh's arrest claim to tell the real and sometimes suppressed story of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. We should be watching 1995, but I wanted to start with 1991 because of the Gulf War. Anyway, all of these stories were and continue to be told publicly by it's the 90s. Enjoy. Told by diverse groups and subcultures within multiple genres: fictional, historical, biographical, academic, and journalistic, and are transmitted through many media: printed, digital, televised, and cinematic. Various readers and commentators have labeled these narratives alternatively as fantastical fiction or accurate historical accounts, the stuff of conspiracy theories, cautionary tales, or dangerous ideological expressions of belief, or radical cynical disbelief. McVeigh remains central with all such stories, yet appears very different depending on the version told. He may appear, yet appears very different. He may appear as one of several unnamed accomplices, a witting or unwitting patsy, steeped in a world of shadows. Spies, cross-dressing neo-Nazis, and doppelganger decoys. That's what he's steeped in. that world. A modern-day Manchurian candidate, victim of nightmarish schemes and inhumane experiments hatched by faceless conspirators, or some combination thereof. Hmm. Recurring elements in the plots of these stories include black helicopters, mysterious clandestine black operators, mad scientists, brainwashing, implanted tracking, and mind control biotechnologies, faked executions, and from time to time UFOs, much like The Sims 4 and 2. Although easily dismissed as fantastical paranoid tales, the mere existence of these narratives raises questions about and poses radical disruptions to historical and current medical, psychological, bioethical, and terrorism discourses. These stories act as causes and solutions to the physical and psychological terror, many products of a covert sphere, knowledge of which may help to distinguish between the signified and the signifier, and then parenthetical symbols of representation and that of which is represented. Fact and philosophy, reality and illusion. We're getting philosophical. The acceptance of one version over another depends upon pre-existing beliefs about what is logical, plausible, implausible, palatable, or simply unimaginable. This work differs from previous treatments of a number of reasons. To begin with, it identifies and compares commonly told stories about McVeigh and the bombing. Stories that more than often not rely upon recycled sources and focuses exclusively on the bombing while providing only a cursory glance at McVeigh himself. This book tests all existing stories against a wealth of newly introduced biographical information gained through personal interviews and archival collections, rendering the majority of previous depictions overly simplistic, deterministic, factually dubious, and devoid of context. When these stories are compared and new information introduced, a very new picture of Generation X's own American terrorist is revealed. The Generation X American terrorist. I'm moving this so you can't see my text, which say I'm bored and anxious. And then other updates. Okay. Secondly, we're still talking about what this book is going to do. Secondly, this book differs from its predecessors by demonstrating how Timothy McVeigh himself told not only the most commonly known and officially sanctioned version, the Lone Wolf story, but before and after his arrest, privately told versions of all of the competing stories that would come to circulate. Finally, the Oklahoma City bombing is continuously invoked to understand other violent acts, and McVeigh as a primary figure to compare the lives, motives, and actions of those who commit them, a circumstance necessitating a more complete understanding of both McVeigh and the bombing, a gap I hope this book helps to fill. There he is. Okay. Method and approach. So this was her PhD Doncarino, her PhD dissertation. So it has some of this stuff, but I promise it's worth it. Oh, am I going in and out again? Please focus on me. I'm right here. I'll move closer to your eye line. How about that? The camera is an eye, you know? Okay. The camera is your eye. Oh shit, a total solar eclipse in 1991. They were talking. That's crazy. Sorry. The frickin' synchronicities. Okay, in the podcast I was listening to earlier, they were talking about the eclipse and how, and someone was like, wasn't there a solar eclipse people were excited about? Guess so. Guess it was in 91. Timothy McVeigh was in the Gulf. Listen to this. Okay. After surveying the majority of publicly available literature about the bombing in McVeigh, I began locating, interviewing, and corresponding with the victims, family members, survivors, witnesses, attorneys, private investigators, journalists, McVeigh's coworkers, friends, neighbors, and underworld associates, including bank robbers, neo-Nazis, militia leaders, and many others. I found these individuals in, among other places, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and New York. Simultaneously, I sought out, where am I? I sought out and obtained hard-to-find documents relating to the case, many that are publicly introduced within this book for the first time. Newly introduced oral and archival history sources include, and are not limited to, material found within the Stephen Jones collection located at the University of Texas, Austin, and the American Terrorist collection located at the Saint Bonaventure University. Gotta get out there to the American Terrorist collection. Someone write that down. Where's my thing? Oh, it's over there. I'm gonna write American Terrorist collection in the chat. Someone write. I can't tell someone to do anything. I'm the only one watching. So I can remember. Shit up. Okay. Thank you. You know, I'm reading this book because it is my favorite. Maybe I should read a book that I haven't read yet. Anyway, after Timothy McVeigh's sentencing in 1997, and at McVeigh's request, his lead attorney, Stephen Jones, was removed from his team of lawyers. In 1998, Jones published his account of the case, Others Unknown, and donated the mountains of material generated by the defense team at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas, Austin. The Jones collection includes, but is not limited to, internal defense team memorandum, meeting notes, investigatory reports, interviews with McVeigh's friends, family, coworkers, and outsiders, personal letters written by and to McVeigh, reports. You know, it's a lot. Okay, how about this? So there's a timeline of events. It's a great. You know, she did her research. We know her research is it's in UT Austin. Okay, so May 24th, 1998. Timothy James McVeigh, age 20, joins the U.S. military, U.S. Army, and is sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for boot camp, where he meets other members of his experimental cohort team. 33-year-old Terry Lynn Nichols and 20-year-old Michael Joseph Fortier. So imagine them as like the Powerpuff gals, right? So 1998, these guys get together. They're put together, you know, as like a project. They're like, okay, so these are the guys who are gonna, you know, they did like surveys and they were like, this is the cohort. I find that so interesting. To go kill, I don't know. Anyway, so in 1990, October 1st, blah blah blah, he's cleared for Special Forces training. That's 2 years later. In 1991, January 16th to March 29th, so he's there currently in the past, if we believe in the year cycle. Timothy McVeigh is deployed overseas for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He is there actually at the famous, does she refer to it? The bulldozer assault that has been in the news, people have been remembering recently. Of course, because they did that, the IOF did that to civilians, which is what Timothy McVeigh also did to civilians. So, different places, but, you know. Okay, anyway, so Timothy McVeigh attends Fort Bragg in North Carolina for Special Forces collection and assessment course. He undergoes psychological evaluations and voluntarily withdraws, thereafter returning to Fort Riley, Kansas. So he's in Fort Bragg for like 4 days, whatever. December 11th, he ends active duty service with the U.S. Army. He's out and is transferred to the New York Army National Guard, where he is obligated to serve cunt until April 11th, 1995, to serve guard. And he returns home to New York, where he works as a security guard. Noble profession. So in 1992, he is granted an early discharge from Nyang Service, New York. That's the New York Army National Guard. You know, these. Anyway, and is transferred to the U.S. Army Reserve Control Group with service obligation and an end date of March 11th, 1986, during which time he can be subjected to annual screening and training, blah, 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 blah. This is a long ass timeline. Anyway, other big sort of points, I guess. That's when he's in. Then he a scheduled raid, an ATF raid of Elohim City, a white separatist community on the Arkansas-Oklahoma border, is called off after a meeting between the ATF, FBI, and U.S. Attorney's Office. That's a big one. Let's see. She does some interesting, like, what she's trying to sort of point to is that throughout sort of the years that Timothy McVeigh was home from, you know, when he was no longer in the service, there started to be these sort of tests with like rider trucks and shit with the I don't know, shit with like the ATF and underground, the ATF, the FBI, and the CIA, and these underground sort of, patriotic white separatist white groups. Anyway, so interesting. Let's read the prologue. Oh shit. Okay, so this is what's happening in 1991 as well behind us. Background. Red Fox dies. Oh. Okay. Constructing the Face of Terror, a historical overview. The usual suspects. Within an hour of the explosion, news crews from every major outlet descended on downtown Oklahoma City. An immediate and constant deluge of around-the-clock live reports and repetitive airing of graphically gruesome images of the bombings, devastation, and carnage came to signify the worst and most deadly attack of terrorism on American soil, forever embedding both the bombing and its representation into public memory. The bombing, quickly characterized as an attack on America's heartland, necessitated the creation of a nationally shared narrative to explain both the event itself and the threat it represented. Initial details used to create the earliest of these stories came from mass reporting of sensationalized or sometimes wholly erroneous speculation, rumor, and commentary. I'm the commentary. Commentary given by counterterrorism and security experts and pundits, as well as contradictory statements issued by government and law enforcement officials. The coverage immediately triggered not a unified narrative, but several divergent ones. Interesting. Immediately after the blast, President Will Clinton assured the country let there be no room for doubt. We will find the people who did this, and we do. Justice will be swift, certain, and severe. These people are killers, and they must be treated as killers. Very apt. Within hours, eyewitnesses in Oklahoma City gave statements to authorities. Some said they observed 2 and sometimes 3 males with swarthy and pirate-like, not really, dark complexions, sitting in a brown Chevrolet pickup truck near the Murrah building just prior to the explosion, who then quickly left the scene afterward. The witnesses described the men as appearing alternatively Middle Eastern, Arab, Hispanic, or Native American. Some say they saw a white male in the driver's seat of a yellow rider moving truck, and a person sitting in the passenger seat parked directly in front of the Murrah, who moments before the blast exited the vehicle and walked off in a separate direction from the driver of the rider, who alone, or in some versions with others, sped away in a yellow 4-door car. Government spokespeople, counterterrorism and security experts, and pundits elaborated on and attempted to make sense of the information for the public, and many formulated theories about Arab jihadist perpetrators. In the following days, the FBI detained, questioned, and released several men of Arab descent. Throughout the country, Middle Easterners became the target of harassment, hate crimes, virulent rhetorical attacks in the media. On the occasion of, in April 19th, the OKC Police Department, OKCPD, OkCupid, issued an all points bulletin for 2 suspects in a brown truck. Although the OkCupid retracted the APB a few days later, it quickly became the source of ongoing confusion and speculation. Don Browning, a required OkCupid canine unit officer, but not a dog. I don't know why. And a first responder recalled his experience of the confusing and rapidly shifting details surrounding the APB in the following quote. By the evening of April 19th, I started to get really concerned. The OkCPD was repeatedly broadcasting an all-points bulletin to the 5-state area that there were 3 vehicles, a brown pickup truck, a blue Chevy Cavalier, and another car, maybe an Oldsmobile or a Buick. I fucking hate an Oldsmobile. They were trying to keep state and region-wide law enforcement aware of the suspects and the vehicles. That evening, As they were working in the building or waiting outside of it to work again, they were still putting out a description of Persian males. They kept telling us that they still had those vehicles under surveillance and said that one had headed south towards Dallas and the other two in different directions. They had every law enforcement officer in the surrounding area and states looking for 3 vehicles and let us continue to believe that. The guys with FBI raid jackets had become the kingpins on the scene. It happens in every movie. Everyone was begging them for information. The next afternoon, I approached one of the agents in charge. That's me. And I'm not an agent in charge. I'm an agent under oath. Anyway, and I asked him what happened. Hey, what's with the deal with the cars? And the FBI man says, what cars? And I said, the pickup and the 2 cars. And he said it again. Disinformation. What are you talking about? I asked. He says, you can't tell the media everything we know about this. I said, okay. But you're telling law enforcement. Yeah. He said it again, disinformation, and then just walked away. Now, they deny broadcasting those descriptions, but I do have a copy of the teletype they issued. Years later, I asked several other law enforcement officers about it, and they also remember the APBs being used. The evening of April 19th, during ABC's show Nightline, Ted Koppel stated the Washington Post, who cited a source close to the investigation, who cited an anonymous source within the FBI, who had reported that at least 8 groups, 7 of them Middle Eastern, had claimed responsibility for the bombing. Koppel opined, if those who committed today's atrocity are, as some officials are inclined to believe, part of a fundamentalist Islamic terrorist group, then they see themselves as part of an army sowing panic in the belly of the great Satan. From their point of view, today's bombing must seem a huge success. Oklahoma State Rep and former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Dave McCurdy, announced on CBS News that there was a very clear evidence of the involvement of fundamentalist Islamic terror groups. ATF Director John McGaugh informed CNN, anytime you have this kind of damage, any kind of this damage, this kind of explosion, you have to look for Middle Eastern terrorists first. Interesting. Okay. New York's Newsday writer, Jeff Kamen, referring to the swarthy suspects, expressed his desire to shoot them now before they get us. Oh. It's going to put on 1992. Okay, we're moving through the 90s. For some, the threat of murderous Middle Easterners seemed a likely one given recent terrorist attacks, such as the 1993 World Trade Center in Manhattan. So we'll see that in the next video. In fact, the OKC bombing followed a series of ongoing attacks against U.S. targets within the Middle East in the 1980s and early 1990s that positioned the subject of terrorism and terrorists as a central focal point within the public discourse, despite the vague definition of these terms. On trial, the very same day that the Oklahoma City bombing occurred was Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 WTC plot, also involving a Ryder truck bomb. This, along with the previous attacks, influenced the immediate public acceptance of the initial Middle Eastern OKC bombing story. Many such cases. The public more readily believes explanations of terrorist incidents when they conform to existing cultural myths, and so, on April 19, 1995, the prevailing American terrorist myth cast barbaric Middle Easterners as the most likely culprit. The stereotypical Arab terrorist featured on nightly news reports paralleled by blockbuster movies that depicted Arab jihadists from any number of foreign countries. I knocked shit over. Films such as The Delta Force, 1986, Terror Squad, 1987, and Navy SEALs, 1990, helped institutionalize racially charged images of swarthy, slimy, despicable, and demonic, holy shit, Middle Eastern fanatics. These pop culture villains sported unkempt beards and headdresses, and wielded bombs and guns for vague political motives, explained simply in terms of their unprovoked irrational hatred of Americans. The plausibility of these theatrics seen, or the degree to which they accurately reflected real-world events, were of little concern to eager viewers of the new terrorist action movie genre. Rather, commanding their attention were the violent aesthetics of the films, the glorious explosion and the myriad ways of depicting death and destruction, all providing a window to observe and by proxy engage in what film studies scholar Stephen Prince termed the theater of mass destruction. That would be interesting to think about a little bit with recent events. The assault on Gaza, maybe. And also, not to be like bowling for but video games are pretty fucking violent, and you do play a guy killing people a lot. Anyway, although I like my XCOM game because it's like Baldur's Gate, for little NATO guys against raceless, extraterrestrials. Thus, for the American public, the initial Middle Eastern terrorist scenario of the OKC bombing was a familiar one that fit into prevailing cultural myths about terrorism and terrorists. As newer information emerged in the days following the bombing, the whodunit narrative underwent radical revisions and newer templates of terrorism appeared, all which coalesced fact, fiction, rumor, and myth with different demonized outsider villains. Checking my audio. Okay. La, da, da, da. Cool. The unusual suspects. As media outlets told the story of the Middle Eastern terrorists, a second narrative was simultaneously forming. This emergent story was one based on observations of OKC witnesses who began talking, first amongst themselves and soon to the media, about the presence of known bomb threats to the Murrah up to 2 weeks before April 19th, one of which had resulted in the evacuation of the building on April 18th, the day before. The OKC Fire Department's chief claimed that his office had received a call from the FBI weeks prior to the bombing, alerting them to a possible threat. And based on the call, there had been a state of heightened security, not just at the Murrah, but covering the entire federal complex in downtown OKC on the morning of April 19th. In addition, a number of people said that in the early hours of April 19th, they observed a number of OKC sheriff and ATF bomb squad trucks and a canine search unit near the Murrah. These reports led to the construction of a story about the government's foreknowledge of the attack. The OKCPD Sergeant Don Browning recounted the strange occurrence he witnessed when he arrived at work early on the morning of April 19th before the explosion. Browning said, "The OKCPD Horse Patrol was gearing up that morning." Sorry, I almost made a horse noise, but I'm not going to do that. All loaded and dressed up. We were told they were being sent out for crowd control. They were en route to downtown when the bomb went off. Why? Why crowd control? There was nothing going on in the downtown. The Arts Fest had not started. They only ever got called out for an event. They don't just do willy-nilly crowd control. There was nothing to indicate that the horse patrol was needed. There was something not quite kosher with all this. Oh my god, Jeffrey Dahmer gone. Holy shit. Not something not quite fucking kosher about that as well, excuse me. Later, I was told by the secretary in the ATF office that the building had been searched for bombs late that night before, on the 18th. The FBI then introduced 2 plot elements and characters into the mix. So that's quote over. The FBI then introduced 2 new plot elements into the mix. One is Tiger Woods' famous wife cheater. No. The majority of accounts attribute the first concrete developments in the case to a VIN number found on the rear axle of the Ryder truck that fell from the sky after the explosion and landed in the wreckage at the blast site. Why not? Fine enough. Okay. By the following afternoon, Thursday, April 20th, the FBI traced it to Elliott's Body Shop, a Ryder rental agency in Junction City, Kansas. There they learned that days before, on Saturday, April 15th, a man using the name Robert Kling had made a phone reservation for the Ryder rental truck on Monday, April 17th. Indeed, Kling arrived on the 17th as promised. The false ID he presented to the Elliott's employees listed Kling's birthday as April 19th, 1963. And coincidentally, the timestamp on the rental agreement read 4:19 p.m. Okay. The owner of the shop, Eldon Elliott, and and 3 other employees present at the time that Kling picked up the rider all said he came in with another man who silently stood in the back of the store and smoked cigs as Kling conducted the transaction. You can smoke cigs in the back of the store in 1995, which is kind of fine, whatever. Okay. Interesting to imagine. I mean, you'd think that would happen a lot. Do people just anyway? FBI field agents began canvassing the Junction City area for leads and released 2 sketches based on the descriptions of the 2 newest suspects, both of whom became known respectively as John Doe 1, JDI, and John Doe 2, JD2. JD1 and JD2. The sketch of you gotta see these. The sketch of JD1 Kling depicted a white male about 5'10" in height, weighing about 180 with a medium build, buzz cut, angular face with a rough complexion, acne, and what appeared to be a deformed chin. Relax. JD2 was a dark-skinned man with dark hair, dark, intense eyes, brooding, beautiful, square jaw, full lips, muscular neck, in his 20s or early 30s, approximately 5'10" in height. They were the same height, approximately 180 in pounds. That they were the same weight, I guess. Serpent-like tattoo on left bicep. The FBI offered a $2 million reward for information leading to their arrest. The sketches matched reports from eyewitnesses in and around downtown OKC. I'm going to show you these sketches. Sometimes I imagine what a police sketch of me would look like because I have so many fucking tatties. It would be easy to find me. So there they are. I don't know. Is that Timmy? One of them isn't Timmy. I don't know if Timmy has a strong jaw. I guess we could look at the photography of Timothy. Okay. Immediately following the release of the sketches, the FBI received a slew of phone calls from people around the country who claimed to know the identities of these men, Beavis and Butthead. Among them was Carl LeBron, a security guard at Calspan. A defense contractor located in Buffalo, New York. On April 21st, LeBron told the FBI that JD1 looked eerily similar to his former coworker named Timothy McVeigh, a racist anti-Semite who was extremely vocal about his anti-government beliefs. In fact, he continued, McVeigh's rhetoric had been so startlingly hate-filled that LeBron once secretly recorded one of their conversations, a tape of which he turned over to the FBI after the bombing. In addition, LeBron gave the FBI a name of another Calspan guard, whom LeBron said he believed was John Doe 2. I think it's cool that military contractors hired virulent anti-Semites and racists, I guess. 37-year... Who's that? I know that guy. Isn't that guy funny? Oh. Thank you for watching, whoever's watching. Okay. Meanwhile, on Friday, April 21st, as LeBron made his phone call to the Buffalo FBI office, the FBI is canvassing in Junction City, Kansas, where Kling rented his rider, led them to the Dreamland Motel. Dreamland. The owner of the Dreamland, Leah McGowan, instantly recognized the sketch of JD1 as a recent guest who arrived in a yellow Mercury Marquis on Friday, April 14th, registered under the name Timothy McVeigh, and on his registration form noted an Arizona license plate whose number was illegible, as well as a Decker, Michigan home address. McVeigh had checked out early on the morning of Tuesday, April 18th. McGowan, her adult son, and several Dreamland guests told agents that the previous Sunday, which happened to be Easter, McVeigh parked an older model, faded rider truck there, but by the evening of Monday, April 17th, had replaced it with a newer, fresher painted model. Interesting. They further recounted to the FBI agents that during his time at Dreamland, McVeigh had received visitors in his motel room. Several guests recalled having to ask McVeigh to move the earlier, faded Ryder truck on more than one occasion as it was blocking other parking spaces. McGowan had placed McVeigh in room 25, which shared a wall with her office. Upon her arrival, she told agents she was certain that on April 16th, Easter Sunday, she had heard at least one male voice, and possibly two, speaking to McVeigh in his room. At least 6 others, all Dreamland guests and employees, also reported seeing a man with McVeigh. They described this man as shorter than McVeigh, about 5'7" and weighing 190 pounds, with a muscular build, olive or dark complexion, a dragon tattoo, and having dark slicked back hair. Dark slicked back hair. What's that? I think you should leave. I don't know. You make someone else make the joke. Okay. No one's watching. Shit. Slick back hair. Slicked back. Various Dreamland witnesses said they saw this man sitting behind the wheel of the newer rider, sometimes with McVeigh sitting in the passenger seat, including on the afternoon of April 17th. The Dreamland accounts were supported by Jeff Davis, a delivery person for Hunan's Chinese restaurant, who said that at about 5 p.m. on Saturday, April 15th, a caller identifying himself as Bob Kling had placed an order for delivery to the Dreamland. Room 25. Davis insisted that if he had to say which JD Sketchman who answered the door and paid for the order resembled, it would be JD2, but stressed that, in actuality, the man he encountered resembled neither the sketch nor a man later identified as Timothy McVeigh. All American demons, the devil you know. Soon after the Elliots, Dreamland, and LeBron leads, the FBI learned that on April 19th, a little over an hour after the explosion in OKC and about an hour northwest of OKC, Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger observed a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis with a missing rear license plate heading away from OKC. The driver promptly pulled over to the side of the road after Hanger signaled him to do so, and identified himself to Hanger as Timothy McVeigh. Although unable to produce a bill of sale or proof of insurance for the car he was driving, McVeigh did disclose to the Hanger that he was carrying a concealed and loaded 45 caliber Glock semi-automatic pistol, which, while registered legally in the state of New York, was somehow nonetheless illegal in Oklahoma. Fascinating. Hanger placed 27-year-old McVeigh under arrest for traffic violations and possession of an illegal gun, and booked him in the nearby jail located in the town of Perry, where he was to await arraignment. I'm going to alter my frame just a bit, although I am really enjoying this. I don't know, maybe I want to turn off, yeah, we don't need that. There we go, that's better. Ooh, I know you see me standing here. Don't I look good, my dear? Don't I look good today? If you wanna... Okay. Hanger described his initial impressions of McVeigh as a clean-cut, well-groomed, and polite young man. Local officials, employees at the jail, and inmates there described McVeigh's demeanor during his time in Perry as seemingly unconcerned, and said he showed no reaction to the live, emotionally charged coverage of the bombing continuously playing in the background during the booking. During his stay at the Perry jail, as he waited to appear before the arraigning judge, McVeigh made several phone falls, unsuccessfully attempting to locate and secure a bail bondsman. Based on the LeBron and Dreamland leads, the FBI tracked McVeigh to Perry jail on April 21st, only minutes before his scheduled arraignment and release, and contacted the Perry district attorney requesting he stall McVeigh's arraignment. An hour after the FBI called the DA, as agents made their way to Perry, a large crowd of ambitious News crews and civilian gawkers gathered outside the small jail/courthouse. Images of a shackled McVeigh in an orange jumpsuit, escorted by federal agents from the front of the Perry jailhouse to a nearby black helicopter, quickly inundated the airwaves. From Perry, McVeigh was taken to nearby Tinker Air Force Base for questioning. Upon first seeing McVeigh, the sizable crowd that had gathered outside the Perry jail began shouting taunts at him, calling him a creep, a murderer, and a baby killer. McVeigh, reporters said, seemed eerily composed and unrepentant, and his countenance, similar to a mask whose powers of concealment seemed also to reveal his ruthlessness and hatred. His lack of visible reaction and thousand-yard stare seemed to provoke and escalate the reactions of the crowd towards him. One report observed that McVeigh seemed to provide an obliging demon towards whom the mounting public fear and anger could be directed. Oh, I got a timer going off. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay. I'll switch my laundry in a minute. Okay. Eerily composed and unrepentant, and his countenance similar to a mask whose powers of concealment seemed also to reveal his ruthlessness and hatred, is a crazy line. His lack of visible reaction. Okay, one report observed that McVeigh seemed to provide an obliging demon towards whom the mounting public fear and anger could be directed. What the crowd and Perry and national news viewers found most disturbing about this demon was his gaze and the look in his eyes. Thus Americans and the world first became acquainted with Timothy James McVeigh. The media made immediate and ongoing comparisons between McVeigh and Lee Harvey Oswald. After being appointed to act as McVeigh's lead defense attorney in early May 1995, Stephen Jones also publicly compared McVeigh's Perry perp walk to that of Oswald's. Jones commented that the repeating airing of these images had created a sense of national déjà vu, and said those old enough to remember saw in McVeigh the ghost of Lee Harvey Oswald. Jones later pointed out that it would have been much easier and safer to whisk McVeigh quickly and quietly out the back of the Perry courthouse, and accused the FBI of tipping off reporters to the scheduled perp walk, during which they paraded McVeigh in front of cameras, thereby scripting and orchestrating a major media event. What major media events are not scripted or orchestrated? McVeigh's race, white. Nationality, American. Background, highly decorated Gulf War veteran. And clean-cut appearance, although they make note about his jaw, starkly contrasted with the initial images of villainous Middle Easterners. A contrast accentuated even further by the arrests of 40-year-old Terry Nichols and 26-year-old Michael Fortier shortly after, his cohorts. McVeigh had listed Terry Nichols of Decker, Michigan, as his next of kin during his initial booking in Perry on April 19th. On April 21st, after hearing his name on the radio in connection with McVeigh and the bombing, Nichols promptly turns himself into local authorities in Decker, Michigan, and at first denied any involvement in the bombing or knowledge of McVeigh's involvement at all, but soon after admitted to limited knowledge of McVeigh's plot. The FBI quickly identified Michael Fortier as a known acquaintance. Is it Michael Fortier or Michael Fortier? I don't care. Known acquaintance of McVeigh's, at whose residence in Kingman, Arizona, McVeigh occasionally resided. Fortier, upon first being questioned by the FBI, denied any involvement, and as no material evidence existed otherwise, he was released. Within weeks, though, Fortier, around the clock surveillance by both the media and the FBI, changed his story, and like Nichols, admitted that he and his wife Lori had limited prior knowledge of Timothy McVeigh's plot. The three men, all white U.S. citizens, had met while serving in the U.S. Army. Their collective profiles starkly conflicted with the existing terrorist template. There was no gang of ragtag, swarthy, wild-eyed Muslim fanatics, but patriotic white Americans and military veterans to boot. Media attention now turned towards the suspects' purported right-wing and anti-government political views, their belief in conspiracy theories, and the larger subcultural milieu they inhabited. The semi-subterranean social realm, broadly referred to as the Patriot Movement, consisted of loosely affiliated but often ideologically similar groups and individuals who included, among others, Second Amendment activists, paramilitary citizen militias, white supremacist separatists, pro-lifers, tax protesters, interesting, survivalists, and proponents of a range of conspiracies, like me. News articles described how McVeigh and Nichols and Fortier were part of a new generation that espoused an updated variant of much older anti-Semitic beliefs about collusion between elements within the U.S. government and the world's elite, the Illuminati, and a secret plot to establish a world government, the New World Order, and total surveillance society. I just want to say the Illuminati thing, which is believed by like many bartenders across this great nation, if YouTube just had, if Google just deleted videos, people would stop being like Beyonce's in charge. Because that's what it is now, or to the people who matter. That's what it is, I don't know. The people who I care about anyway. Beyonce is not in charge. She's in charge of some stuff, which maybe isn't good, but I don't know. not the kind of, she's in charge of the Beyonce empire. The black helicopter crowd believed UN troops would soon round up, disarm, and imprison U.S. citizens within concentration camps, often to be run by FEMA. Fancying themselves modern American revolutionaries, some were gearing up for war with the government. The events of Ruby Ridge, Idaho in 1992 and Waco, Texas in 1993, as well as the passage of the Brady Bill, catalyzed both the mobilization and the alliance of these disparate groups and individuals. I was watching Wendigoon's Ruby Ridge video, and I didn't realize that it wasn't actually called Ruby Ridge. I had never heard that before. This book actually covers it in an interesting, super cool way that I could get to if we read it. Prior to the bombing, the emergent movement was virtually invisible to the public at large. Very soon after, though, an increasing number of pundits, officials, and experts linked the paranoid worldviews of this relatively homogenous mass of militant right-wing extremists to the willingness to commit violent criminal activity, and warned that, while on the fringe, they represented a threatening and growing culture of conspiracy in the mainstream. News outlets now began to report on the strange opinions expressed by the racist militias and kooks around McVeigh, some of whom knew him. Their statements to the media echoed long-established conspiracy theory plots and introduced the beginnings of what became an entire subgroup of alternative narratives in which the bomber, wittingly or otherwise, becomes an Oswaldian figure. Notorious neo-Nazi spokesperson, Aryan Nation's founder Richard Butler, told reporters that they suspected McVeigh was a patsy, perhaps even a CIA agent, thereby iterating an earlier version of guilty agent stories about the bombing suspect. On Sunday, April 23rd, a friend of McVeigh's in Michigan told reporters that McVeigh believed the government had implanted a tracking chip in his rear end so the all-seeing eye of the government could keep an eye on him and know where he was. That's the third eye for you. The same day, April 23rd, the FBI received a call from Linda Thompson, an Indianapolis attorney, militia spokesperson, and producer of an underground documentary, Waco, The Big Lie, which advanced a theory that the government had deliberately set the fire that killed the Branch Davidians. Thompson told agents that a certain Dr. Jolly West, a CIA operative who conducted mind control experiments, had implanted microchips in McVeigh and other U.S. soldiers. Thompson also relayed these claims to the Indianapolis Star, who quoted her in their April 24th report. The public voicing of such sentiments introduced not only a new character, Dr. Jolly on West, into the mix, but also stands as the first publicly told experimental wolf stories about McVeigh. We're still in the prologue here. Oh my god, everything happened tonight. Is it going to play 93 next? You better. There's McConaughey. We love McConaughey. I want to get to the end of the prologue. I'm going to grab a seltzer. Hey. Hey, remember the good times make me up and it's over. Buddy Country Willie. Oh shit. We are officially at Willie Nelson. Oh, we missed Willie Nelson. I missed Willie Nelson. Um, I almost grabbed a Bud Light. I felt that was a little too underemployed, but it is a lot like seltzer. It is a lot like a Bud Light. It is sad that it's not beautiful outside and not a beer on the porch day. So, thank you, thank you. Whew. And I switched my laundry. We are in good shape. All right, I'm going to continue to read. I assume that's what you're here for. anyone who was here. Okay. Yeah, okay. I could put on like footage of Timothy McVeigh, but it would just seems like it's, I don't know, this is my context. Oh man, cats are fighting. Cats are fighting out there. Ooh. Hey! Here. We don't fight. While acts of politically motivated violence committed on American soil by U.S. citizens were by no means a new phenomena. An emergent category of homegrown domestic terrorism increasingly occupied a central place in terrorism discourse, and the arrest of Timothy McVeigh brought forth the rhetorical coupling of conspiracy theorists and others with a newly emergent terrorist threat. In response, all manner of claim makers garnered support for a new range of policies and practices meant to combat the existence and spread of threatening ideologies and subcultures. Lettuce is sick of it. Go, 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 go! Don't fight out there, though. Okay. On Monday, April 24th, 1995, President Bill Clinton assured the public that he would expand the powers and budgets granted to counterterrorism and intelligence agencies to give law enforcement more effective means of investigating extremist groups in order to root out and eradicate the ever larger threat the bombing might indicate. Prior to the bombing, Congress refused to pass a controversial anti-terrorism bill proposed by the Clinton administration, but on April 25th, the first draft of it passed in the Senate, and a year later passed in its final form with overwhelming bipartisan support. Interesting. The newer version of the previously proposed legislation greatly increased the powers and budgets allotted to counterterrorism, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies with the stated goal of more effectively investigating, monitoring, and eradicating extremist groups through the FBI's and other law enforcement agencies' use of undercover surveillance and sting operations. Further, the new legislation retroactively allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty for any suspect convicted of participation in the OKC bombing. On April 23rd, the FBI announced they were still searching for anywhere from 4 to 6 other unidentified conspirators. During a press conference the next day, Clinton promised that although the number of individuals involved in the bombing of the Murrah was unknown as of yet, no stone would be left unturned. All leads would be followed, and all perpetrators found and convicted. Justice would be certain, swift, and severe, and prosecutors would seek the death penalty for those found guilty. At the same conference, Janet Reno reminded viewers that although authorities had McVeigh and Nichols in custody, the case remained open and stressed that the JD2 remained at large and was considered armed and dangerous. John Doe 2. Where is he, John Doe 2? Although the official number of suspected participants in the bombing continued to change, on May 1st, the cover of Time featured a photo of McVeigh declaring his face the face of terror. On April 25th, however, another face of terror emerged when the FBI released a second sketch of the stocky, dark-skinned JD2, this time with a baseball cap on. I don't know what a basketball cap is. The second sketch was based on numerous eyewitnesses in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arizona who claimed to have seen McVeigh with others in the weeks, days, hours, and minutes before the explosion, as well as immediately afterwards. On May 8th, Time quoted unnamed federal investigators who said that McVeigh and the John Doe were in no way lone bombers, but rather more likely cogs in a much larger network of extremists who had assisted in the bombing conspiracy through financing or tactical support. Then on May 10th, the Los Angeles Times quoted unnamed investigators and authorities who relayed a working theory that John Doe 2 could be two people, John Doe 2.2. Excuse me. We had accompanied McVeigh to OKC this morning of the OKC the morning of the bombing in order to act as decoys in the hope of confusing eyewitnesses and therefore authorities later, a version of the Pack of Wolves story. The search for the John Does became the most intensive manhunt in American history at the time, with the FBI conducting over 25,000 interviews and running down 43,000 leads in an attempt to find them. In the process, the FBI arrested, cleared, and released several individuals, one of them live on television. That's crazy. I want to find that. You know something? I do love this, but is there some Timothy McVeigh arrest footage? Yeah. Try this. Okay. This is maybe some more. Okay, so meanwhile, as the FBI sought to determine if McVeigh had acted as a leader or a follower, a mastermind, or just one of many foot soldiers in a much larger ring of conspirators and like-minded terrorists, media outlets speculated about McVeigh's motives at the same time. Depending on the report, McVeigh's downward spiral and violent aspirations began when he washed out of his Special Forces tryout. He washed out. Interesting. Became disillusioned about the role that the U.S. and himself had played in the Gulf War, developed Gulf War syndrome, or after he became enraged by the militaristic and warlike tactics used against the Branch Davidians at Waco, Texas, and what he perceived as a general loss of civil liberties. Thus McVeigh assumed the cloak of the disgruntled soldier avenger. On April 21st, McVeigh was taken from Perry to nearby Tinker Air Force Base for further questioning and arraignment, and once there was charged with the primary and thus far only suspect in the bombing. He was appointed two public defenders, John Coyle and Susan Otto, to whom, unknown to the public but documented within the Jones collection, McVeigh made a very strange confession. He told Coyle and Otto that while in the National Guard, which he had joined after leaving active duty Army service, we remember that, he had been recruited to work undercover as part of a domestic security operation. McVeigh said his mission was to infiltrate and report on neo-Nazis and other domestic terror threats. McVeigh then said that after having discovered the bombing plot, he reported it to his handlers, but it was instructed to continue in his role, remain embedded within the conspiracy, and even go as far as to participate in the bombing, but ensure that only a couple of windows were blown out of the Murrah building. McVeigh expressed his shock that the rider could have caused as much damage as it did, and wondered if someone may have switched the truck at the last minute without his knowledge. While within the weeks and months to come, his story would undergo radical transformation, McVeigh's initial confession to Otto and Coyle stands, as, while not the first, the earliest known post-arrest guilty agent story that McVeigh would tell. From Tinker Air Force Base, McVeigh was taken to El Reno State Prison, where he remained until shortly before his trial. Within days of his confession to them, Otto and Coyle recused themselves from the case, citing conflicts of interest. They were replaced on May 8, 1995, when Stephen Jones, a charismatic small-town lawyer from Enid, Oklahoma, was appointed to defend McVeigh. According to Jones, while discussing the transfer of the case, Otto cryptically warned Jones that when you know everything I know, and you will soon enough, you will never think of the United States of America the same way. So, great sign there. Jones now represented the man touted in the headlines as the most hated man in America. While all suspects face the possibility of receiving a death sentence if convicted, federal prosecutor Joseph Hartzler announced his intent to send McVeigh specifically straight to hell. Facing a formidable task, Jones amassed a sizable defense team that ultimately came to consist of 14 attorneys, 5 paralegals, scores of researchers and private investigators, and consultants whose fields of expertise included mental health, media analysis, forensics, explosives, terrorism, intelligence, and social political movements. During his first meeting with Jones, McVeigh calmly and proudly and dispassionately confessed that although he had not meant to kill children, he had bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building and had gotten caught on purpose, hoping to use his trial to demonstrate that the government's actions at Waco, Texas on April 19, 1993 had been abusive and illegal. In what the Jones team referred to as McVeigh's necessity defense, McVeigh believed the federal government's actions at Waco posed a threat to himself and the citizenry, as well as the constitutional foundations of the United States. Therefore, McVeigh, believing he must intervene, conceived of, planned, and executed the bombing alone as an act of self-defense in the face of an encroaching threat to his life and the lives of others. When Jones asked about John Doe 2, JD2, McVeigh denied that any such person existed, and ironically accused those who insisted otherwise of being conspiracy theorists. He further informed his attorneys that he intended to embarrass the government during his trial and hoped that after the evidence is heard, the case remains a mystery. As McVeigh explained, it had historical value and certain details about it must remain secret. He also made it clear that for purposes of his criminal trial and historical legacy, he wanted to take full responsibility for the bombing and demanded his legal team not direct culpability towards any other individual, including, but not limited to, Nichols and Fortier, the earliest version of the Lone Wolf story. Despite McVeigh's stated objections, during his first week as McVeigh's attorney, Jones sought a meeting with Attorney General Janet Reno with the intent of brokering a deal with federal prosecutors. He proposed that in exchange for sparing McVeigh the death penalty, Jones would offer up the identity of John Doe 2. According to Jones, although McVeigh initially agreed with the strategy, he quickly changed his mind and withdrew his permission. Jones immediately concluded that regardless of whether or not McVeigh had acted alone, in order to mitigate the effect of McVeigh's demonization in the media, he would need to be defended not only in the court of law, but also in the court of public opinion. You know, classic lawyer shit, good strategy. Public opinion. Now public opinion for, like, high-profile cases is, I don't know. TikTok. It's hiring a large contingency of streamers and TikTokers to say that the other person's an abuser or whatever, like with the Amber Heard thing. Hang on, I don't know. Oh, there you go. You can't hear me. Okay, perfect. Okay. Sorry, I need to find where I was. Okay, despite McVeigh's stated objections, Jones immediately concluded that regardless of whether or not McVeigh had acted alone, in order to mitigate the effect of McVeigh's demonization in the media, he would need to be defended, not only in the court of law, but also in the court of public opinion. To this end, Jones conceived of a public relations strategy and, in the ensuing months, formed several quid pro quo relationships with journalists from media outlets with whom he could exchange investigative information. At one of many subsequent press conferences, Jones announced the defense team's intent to present McVeigh as we believe he really is and expose the truth about the bombing. Jones's public relations strategy backfired, or appeared to backfire early on, when on May 17, 1995, the New York Times published an article containing a number of highly damaging statements attributed to McVeigh, said to have been made privately to his attorney before being leaked to the press. Included was McVeigh's confession of guilt and denial that any other conspirators existed. In addition, the article discussed telephone records from McVeigh's calling card purchased under the name Darrell Bridges, suggesting that McVeigh had maintained connections to a number of white power movements throughout the country, or had at least attempted to contact them using the card immediately prior to the bombing. The article also reported that McVeigh told his attorneys where authorities might find his fingerprints, as well as leftover bomb-making materials and other incriminating evidence. Nobody agreed on the origins of the leaked information or the paths it had followed before finding its way to the headlines. The Jones team and the prosecution publicly pointed fingers at each other. Jones maintained that the leaks were a result of government sabotage, and in July 1995, he filed motions at the court, with the court expressing concern that prison officials and federal authorities were eavesdropping on McVeigh's meetings with attorneys and intercepting their phone calls. I imagine all of that was happening. McVeigh, outraged, placed the blame squarely on Jones, an accusation that a number of Jones team staffers came to agree with. In response to the leak, McVeigh wrote that first of many scathing letters to his attorneys, complaining to them that Jones was too focused on the media and that only days after his assumedly confidential confession to Jones, almost my exact words hit the front page of the New York Times. McVeigh also verbalized this to a number of people on his defense team. When he learned of his client's accusations about him, Jones wrote to McVeigh and explained that the defense team's relationship with the media was an unfortunate necessity, and the journalists with whom he cultivated relationships could function as extra investigators for the team. The confession article in the Times foreshadowed many similar leaks over the next 2 years, which led to a sustained attorney-trial struggle, mainly between Jones and McVeigh about, among other things, who could tell the story of the bombing, how it would be told, and who would script and control McVeigh's public image. Holy shit. Here's some, yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. There's the FBI. Here's the ATF. Okay. While Jones publicly claimed otherwise, this lawyer, Jones, the head of McVeigh's case, defense attorney Jones, he claimed otherwise publicly. In his letter to McVeigh, Jones reminded his client that he, McVeigh, had given Jones permission to speak to the New York Times. Jones then noted McVeigh's stubborn desire to take full credit for the bombing and opined that the only reason McVeigh had given Jones permission to speak to the media was to send a signal to other unidentified conspirators that he was willing to accept full blame for the act of terror. In his book, Others Unknown, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing Conspiracy, written after the conclusion of McVeigh's trial, Stephen Jones expressed his opinion that from the moment they first met, McVeigh intended to take full credit for the bombing and craved recognition, publicity, acknowledgement, and he couldn't let it go. Jones said that McVeigh continually asked if he could go public and proclaim his responsibility, but to do so would be to assure McVeigh received a guilty verdict and a death sentence. On the other hand, Jones said he recognized that if McVeigh was not permitted to make such a statement publicly, the other unidentified bombing conspirators, whom Jones firmly believed existed, would fear McVeigh's possible disclosure of their identities, and therefore would orchestrate a Jack Ruby incident and attempt to assassinate McVeigh. There's the sketches. Remember those? I'll show those earlier. If they believed he planned to take the fall for the bombing, they might let their guards down. Therefore, Jones said, it was incumbent on me to find a way to protect Tim and at the same time assuage his cravings for fame. That's a fun word. Thus, Jones said he suggested to McVeigh that they leak a confession to the press, and McVeigh seized on the idea and insisted that Jones proceed. Therefore, Jones made a deal with McVeigh, agreeing to orchestrate a confession leak in exchange for McVeigh's promise not to speak to the media on his own accord. From then on, wrote Jones, McVeigh was effectively muzzled. McVeigh, however, recalled the incident very differently in a letter to his biographers written 4 years later. McVeigh explained to them that after the New York Times article was published, other members of the legal team learned that Jones himself had leaked the information, and when Jones realized they knew, he sought McVeigh's retroactive permission to speak to the media. Jones gave them to my own attorney. Then 2 or 3 days after the release, he coerced me into signing a permission slip attributing my consent for the leaks. While he considered firing Jones at this time, the thought of bringing a new attorney up to speed on this case seemed too daunting, and so he relented and signed the consent form that Jones had drafted. Interesting. Indeed, in his 2012 book, former Jones investigator Roger Charles noted that McVeigh's authorization granting Jones permission to speak to the Times was signed and dated on May 18th, the day after the story ran. Further, according to Charles, other attorneys on the team witnessed Jones bragging about having obtained McVeigh's signature, even though at the time McVeigh had no interest in making a public confession. Charles said that despite Jones's claims that he leaked the confession to protect McVeigh and prevent him from having a lengthier, more damaging confession on television, it was never clear how protection was achieved by a front-page confession in the world's most authoritative newspaper. No one is acting in a way that makes any sense, I guess, is what, I don't know, I would like to communicate while reading this. McVeigh told his biographers about his misgivings about the trustworthiness of certain members of his defense team began early on and had led him to outline his security concerns to them, and on numerous occasions warn about the dangers of diffusing confidential information too widely. McVeigh said his fears were continuously met with a, yeah, kid, you're going to teach me, your elder, or something attitude. It was at this point McVeigh told his biographers that he came to the realization that his entire defense team and defense was one big clusterfuck. Quote me on that later. Yet, by the time his lawyers took him seriously, it was too late. The New York Times confession was closely followed by a steady stream of headlines such as "McVeigh says he was the bomber," "McVeigh admits role," and "McVeigh admits Oklahoma City bomb massacre." Like the New York Times piece, these reports publicly publicized inflammatory and incriminating details known only to defense team members while attributing them to anonymous sources. So they've got a leaker. They got a leak. They're leaking. Coochie leak. All right. The damning leaks of confidential attorney-client case material and its appearance in press reports continued to plague the Jones team throughout the pretrial phase and became not only a recurring and defining issue of the defense team, but reflected the larger ongoing struggles over secrecy, disclosure, and control of information that proved endemic to the case. According to Jones team attorney Randy Coyne, the leaks eventually demoralized other members of the team and caused irreparable damage between the defense team and McVeigh. While initially the relationship between McVeigh and Nichols' defense's teams were cooperative, the leaks also contributed to the disintegration of any working relationship between them. Former defense attorney for Nichols, Ron Woods, recalled a frustrating incident that began with a gesture of professional courtesy when Woods provided discovery materials to Jones consisting of statements Nichols had made to the FBI. "I told Jones not to give the material to anybody. Still frustrated Woods. However, the next day, Nichols' statements appeared on the Los Angeles Times, so we decided not to share information with Jones because he appeared to be talking to the media incessantly." Which is kind of, the opposite of what it sounded like he wanted anyway. Okay. At the time, though, no matter who had leaked or who knew about it, Jones very publicly and falsely denied the veracity of the confession articles and doggedly pressed on with his plan to humanize his client. In doing so, becoming a co-author of McVeigh's public persona. Weeks after the initial New York Times confession article appeared, Jones released portions of McVeigh's military records and photos of a smiling and laughing McVeigh meeting with his attorneys. Additionally, Jones made McVeigh available to several reporters and photographers for the purpose of conducting off-the-record interviews under the conditions that they did not photograph his client in handcuffs or ask questions about the bombing itself. Great rules. Really will get, yeah. Among the reporters chosen to interview McVeigh and help mitigate his demonization was Newsweek writer David Hackworth, who conducted the first on-the-record prison interview with McVeigh in June 1995. Jones described his client as the boy next door, the boy wonder, and told Hackworth he's innocent. McVeigh spoke to Hackworth about his small-town childhood in rural upstate New York, his combat in the Persian Gulf, denied having ever been a militia member, and expressed that he was horrified upon learning of the deaths of children in the Murrah building and stated his intent to plead not guilty. Hackworth's article offered a very different impression of McVeigh from the seemingly cold, heartless man who had walked out of the Perry courthouse. Hackworth wrote that although media reports commonly depicted McVeigh as a brooding, gun-obsessed drifter, in reality, the public, Hackworth observed that during their conversation, in reality, the public knew virtually nothing about America's newest terrorist. Sorry, I have to drink more. Not Bud Light. Reading for a long time is hard. No wonder you do it in groups. Brooding, obsessed, gun-obsessed drifter. A fellow veteran, Hackworth, observed that during their conversation, McVeigh was in high combat form, fully aware that his performance in the interview was almost a matter of life and death. If he'd been in combat, he would have earned a medal for his coolness under fire. In fact, wrote Hackworth, McVeigh is a more subtle and intriguing figure, at once more clever and ingenious than his tabloid personality, savvy, world-weary, and very media-wise. He was no militaristic automaton, didn't seem like a baby killer, and resembled a typical Gen Xer more than a deranged loner, much less a terrorist. McVeigh appeared good-humored, self-aware, and seemingly normal. Although this was the image McVeigh wanted to project, and the possibility always remained, warned Hackworth, that Timothy McVeigh might also be the most devious con man to ever come down the pike, at times McVeigh came across as the boy next door. You might never want to let him into your house, but you might never want to let him into your house. I don't know. Remember when people were like, I would drink a beer with George Bush? I wouldn't let him in my house. To his biographers later, McVeigh described the Newsweek article as accurate, but said that his skin crawled during the interview because he could not fully explain himself. When Hackworth asked, "Are you guilty?" I have to say, we're pleading not guilty. I wanted to say, well, I'm not guilty in a moral sense. I don't think I've committed a crime. You can't say that. The Hackworth interview, he continued, had been his idea, but all subsequent ones had been Jones's fucked up idea that he nevertheless consented to for various reasons. For instance, said McVeigh, he granted CNN's Susan Candiotti an interview because he had the hots for her. I'd smile at Candiotti and other newswomen who came in who were hot. Jones wanted to make points with the media so he would help them with the investigation. He kept trying to coach me to meet certain people. He didn't like the media, but I didn't like the media, but I did see one benefit, and I joked about it. I openly said, Jones, you bring me good-looking chicks, I'll meet with them. For me, it was something to jerk off to at night. Great. For him, it was a connection with the media. For him to become a powerful person. I met with Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters off the record. I was looking for a blowjob in some of those visits. One time this girl came in with one of the investigators. I think she left the seat wet. She was horny. A high profile and popularity turns on some people. I took a sip of her pop, passed it back to her. She said, I'm keeping this can. I felt like saying, crawl under to the table and take care of me, honey. That is a quote from Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh also left a favorable impression to other other reporters who interviewed him or met with him informally, and who, like Hackworth, found him to be friendly, boyish, and charming. Even the many reporters who never met him in person seemed to agree, including Buffalo area journalist Brandon Stickney, who described him as a seemingly normal boy, someone who could be found in almost any average American neighborhood, just a good old all-American man. McVeigh's natural charm impressed members of his legal team as well. Stuart Wright, sociologist and consultant of the Jones team, described McVeigh as soft-spoken, introspective, curious, friendly, possessing a boyish quality that defied the stereotypical image of an embittered radical. He didn't strike me as a terrorist. Likewise, Jones team attorney Randy Cohen's first impressions were tall, young, serious, disciplined, articulate, and passionate. Nevertheless, mental health experts hired by the Jones team who met with and evaluated McVeigh throughout the pretrial phase did not always buy McVeigh's nice guy act. For example, on August 31st, 1995, clinical psychologist, neurologist, psychotherapist, and hypnotist H. Anthony Simone, Ph.D., detailed some of his clinical impressions in the memo written to the Jones team attorney Dick Burr. Dick Burr. 2 R's in that. It is just too easy to get to know Tim. Simone wrote. I don't believe the apparent openness into which he greeted me, and I distrust his demonstration of warmth toward you. Simone concluded, I think Tim is as shrewd and clever as they come. A review of Hackworth's Newsweek piece entitled Interview with a Monster asserted that the article provided a closer look at McVeigh, aka America's most evil incarnate. The review argued that while Hackworth's article and the accompanying photo spread wrongfully humanized McVeigh, it also helped the public see past the now generically familiar psychological and political caricature of him that had been exhaustively recycled in the mass media. Thus, while admitting that McVeigh's persona was rhetorically constructed and mediated and required critical deconstruction, efforts to do so were paradoxically seen as taboo and ethically wrong. Still, largely through the Jones PR campaign, McVeigh, the newest all-American media demon, emerged also as an American media darling. Time magazine, which had deemed McVeigh the face of terror, went on to name him as a runner-up for the 1995 Man of the Year award, a distinction he lost to Newt Gingrich, and shared with other runner-ups Bill Gates, Johnny Cochran, and O.J. Simpson. I think we very often make monsters into media darlings. But also, defining monster. Anyway, during Jones's many media appearances, he repeatedly insisted that McVeigh had been the first arrested. He became at first a demon, and after a vehicle of catharsis for the American public in the aftermath of the bombing. In one pretrial court filing on October 4th, 1996, Jones argued that the defense team's relationship with the press was required to negate a year and a half of people who have constantly gone on national television and talked about killing him, clawing his eyes out, saying he's a monster, an introvert, a lunatic, a right-wing nut, and a racist. Initially, other members of the defense team saw the wisdom in Jones's PR plan. Jones's team attorney, Randy Coyne, explained that Jones's courting of the media made sense during the pretrial stage. His regular press conferences might help negate the many prejudicial stories that described McVeigh as a right-wing extremist, anti-government zealot, militia sympathizer, survivalist, and anarchist, and the descriptions and depictions of him as a cold, emotionless, and steely-eyed. The majority of the media reports stressed the importance of guilty verdicts and hinted darkly that death would be the only suitable punishment. Seriously undercut the assumption of innocence and completely compromised the possibility that McVeigh might be fairly trialed, either in Oklahoma or by Oklahoma jurors. Jones, said Coyne, believed that the reporters he courted would be hitting the pavement and looking for the story, just like investigators that are hired by the defense team and by the legion of FBI agents and other investigators that worked on behalf of the federal government. And their doing so could develop information for the Jones team. Still, according to Coyne, for members of the Jones team and their client McVeigh, Jones's PR plan became an obstacle in preparing and providing an adequate defense case. By the time of the trial, the media became at first a distraction and then ultimately a fickle ally if one viewed them as being an ally. At first, I don't think Tim minded as much, but then concluded, like a lot of other people did, that it wasn't in his best interest to play Tom Thumb to Stephen Jones's P.T. Barnum. While at first Jones thought the media could operate as independent investigators or the defense, the problems came later in regards to the disclosure of defense documents and the lack of security on the defense team as far as protecting the clients' confidences. This was certainly frustrating with the defense team's relationship with the media. That was according to Coyne. Great last name. Thus began what would prove to be a highly complicated, controversial love-hate relationship between the media, McVeigh, his defense team, the victims, the FBI, and the prosecution, plus, positioned in the middle of the fray, the public. Originally, Nichols and McVeigh were going to stand trial together as co-defendants on the conspiracy charges, but defense attorneys for both parties formally requested a severance, fearing that, if tried together, the prejudicial statements made by one could be used against the other. Both defense teams also asked the court to change the trial locations from Lawton, Oklahoma, a small town about an hour from Oklahoma City, to another state. Attorneys for Nichols, who had kept a low profile since his arrest and refused to make contact with the media, feared the ongoing demonization would make it impossible for him to obtain a fair trial. Public opinion polls in Oklahoma showed that the majority both believed that Nichols and McVeigh were guilty and deserved the death penalty. During the February 1996 severance and change of venue hearings, presiding judge Richard P. Match noted the intensity and repetition of victim-oriented news in Oklahoma. He explained that while reports in Oklahoma tended to humanize the victims more often than not, they often demonized the defendants. The majority of these, observed Match, focused on McVeigh specifically and included the statements of victims that emphasized McVeigh's evil inhumanity. They complained that McVeigh smiled too much in court and expressed their wish that he would show remorse. Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier had not attracted the same level of media or of public fascination as McVeigh, by design it seems like, and bore the brunt of far less media scrutiny. The shy, quiet, mousy Nichols consistently presented himself as a man, not a monster. Bombing victims said Nichols seemed like a nicer person, less threatening, more like a real estate salesman than a terrorist. Based on considerations of the victims' understandably vitriolic responses to McVeigh, Match granted both the severance and venue change and relocated the trials of both to Denver, Colorado. McVeigh appeared to cling to a strange belief that if only he could explain his motivations, the victims would understand and accept him and his action. Yet his attempts to address their feelings were often clumsy and were viewed by the victims as intentionally insulting and dismissive. At times, he referred to them as the woe is me crowd. So crazy. But explained that by this he meant only those victims who seemed to display an insatiable need to seek the spotlight and were hell-bent on attacking him as a person. Despite his ill-conceived efforts to get them to understand him, the highly public contention between McVeigh and the bombing victims, along with his many callous remarks towards them, became an integral element in the saga of his evolving public persona. Jones's strategic relationship with the press and the provocative court filings and arguments, ostensibly meant to humanize McVeigh and counter the overwhelming negative pretrial publicity, only provoked further outrage among victims. Eventually, Jones's continued courting of the media culminated in a prosecutor's request that Match impose a limited gag order barring all attorneys from discussing case-related information with the press. Jones and several media outlets made formal appeals and arguments against the request. Match scheduled hearings to resolve the issue, and in the interim, in what prosecutors described as a public relations blitz, Jones held a series of press conferences wherein he continued to assert that the media's factually inaccurate, demonizing and dehumanizing coverage, especially the widely circulated Perry Perp Walk footage, had prematurely and erroneously depicted McVeigh as guilty, scared off potential defense witnesses, and ultimately sizzled into the consciousness of the nation a portrait of McVeigh as an anti-government killer, a marginalized figure, an aberration, a person who lived alone and embittered, and as a loser whose own inadequacies produced the tragedy. Then in a court filing during this time, Jones asserted that the most vocal bombings victims and survivors had no interest in the facts. They don't want to be bothered with the facts. They have already formed their opinion. Appalled, prosecutors implored Match to order a total gag order, and Match consented, provoking criticism from the First Amendment advocates and media outlets. The gag order was met with secret relief by a number of the defense team, who themselves had become weary of Jones's actions by this time. By this time, Coyne recalled that from the outset of his involvement with the case, I felt strongly that disproportionate time and energy were spent on ancillary media matters. Coyne said he was frequently pulled away from important defense-related tasks to research and brief the First Amendment and media law issues in order to preserve Jones's right to swamp the airwaves with daily public appearances and sound bites. At the time, Coyne felt that the attention given to McVeigh's media defense should have subsided after Match issued the change of venue and the severance rulings in their favor. But by then, Coyne reflected, Jones had become addicted to the attention lavished on him by the press, comparing Jones's personal quest to saturate the media to a heroin junkie in the throes of withdrawal trying to score another fix. Interesting. Oh, there he is. He does have real boy next door energy. I mean, he's just like a little white boy. He's just a little white boy. I don't know. Is he an Oswald? Let's keep going. After Match issued the total gag order, a series of angry letters flew back and forth between McVeigh and Jones. McVeigh said he agreed with Match's decision and accused Jones of caring more about becoming a celebrity than defending him. Jones, in turn, admonished McVeigh for his ongoing temper tantrums and accused McVeigh of intentionally sabotaging the efforts of his own legal team by stonewalling their investigations into other conspirators so that he could use the trial to air his theories about what happened at Waco, Texas. While Jones had earlier agreed to incorporate the issue into McVeigh's defense strategy, he was not above extortion and when it suited him. On November 25, 1996, Jones warned McVeigh that if he did not begin to cooperate, he could kiss the Waco aspect goodbye, and informed other members of the defense team that the time had come to be stern with McVeigh and suggested placing an embargo on attorneys' visits with him. The following day, in retaliation, McVeigh took matters into his own hands and began making contact with reporters without Jones's knowledge or consent. He wrote a letter to the Oklahoma Gazette, but as he would many times, failed miserably to endear himself to the paper's local readers or soften his negative image. McVeigh accused the FBI of using the media to control information about the bombing and of demonizing him by spreading propaganda, the same tactic they had used against the Branch Davidians at Waco. The FBI, he said, had prevented the public from seeing images of the charred remains of children's bodies at Waco, and therefore nobody cared when the families died a slow, torturous death as they were gassed and burned alive at the hands of the FBI, or when boastful FBI agents posed for the camera as the people's lives were consumed in flames. McVeigh said the truth about his own case and the events at Waco lies deeper, but in order to get it to the public, he argued people needed to question and analyze what they hear and ponder the intentions of those spreading the propaganda. After the Gazette published the letter, the FBI came to the offices of the paper and confiscated it. All right, now we are on the Legend of John Doe 2. This is still the freaking prologue. So we might... Long ass prologue, 59-page prologue. Okay, I can do... Okay. For McVeigh, the only acceptable public legacy was one wherein he was a hero who, perceiving grave threats to the citizenry of the United States, had alone conceived of the plot to bomb the Murrah building and, of his own volition, with only minor help from Nichols and Fortier in the preparation stages, carried out his plan alone the morning of April 19th. Yet, as McVeigh became America's face of lone wolf terrorism, details in the Pack of Wolves story were quickly amassing. Earlier on, various members of the Jones team, and Jones most of all, had begun to doubt McVeigh's lone wolf version of events. Their doubts grew with a continual emergence of evidence which strongly suggested the involvement of others in the plot. And as they increasingly perceived stark inconsistencies in McVeigh's story that often conflicted with known physical evidence and countless witness statements, an ongoing flurry of news articles based on leaked defense team information reported that McVeigh had links to a number of well-known neo-Nazi and white power movement organizations and spokespeople, and that these associations went much deeper than had been publicly discussed or leaked by the prosecution, FBI, and defense teams. The most notable of these concerns was his links to Elohim City, which we just saw on screen, a white separatist community on the Oklahoma-Arkansas border known as a safe haven for fugitives within the white power movement. Shortly before the bombing, McVeigh received 2 speeding tickets within miles of Elohim City, and nearby motel registration records and statements made by residents there strongly suggested that McVeigh had not only called Elohim City, but had visited on more than one occasion. Oddly, in 1983, individuals associated with Elohim City had hatched their own plot to blow up the Murrah building using a car or truck bomb, and the group, residing in a different racialist survivalist community, had been raided and arrested for other crimes on April 19, 1985. On the morning of April 19, 1995, the state of Arkansas executed Richard Wayne Snell, a main participant in the failed 1983 plot. On the morning of April 19, 1995, Snell's final words addressed to Arkansas Governor Jim Tucker were, "Governor Tucker, look over your shoulder. Justice is coming. I wouldn't trade places with you or any of your cronies. Hail the victory. I am at peace." In the years leading up to it, Snell's impending execution attracted protests nationally from adherents to the farthest reaches of the extremist paramilitary right wing. In the 2 years leading to the bombing, McVeigh attended over 80 gun shows in 40 states. In October 1993, only weeks after registering at a motel and receiving a speeding ticket near Elohim City, McVeigh had written his sister a letter informing her that he was traveling the country on the gun show circuit and establishing a network of friends. Information such as this certainly suggests that McVeigh had been involved in a much broader plot. Internal Jones team memoranda noted that McVeigh could not reasonably account for all the eyewitnesses who said they saw him with others in the days leading up to April 19th, 1995, as well as those who saw him with anywhere from 1 to 4 individuals in OKC on the morning of the bombing. In fact, every person who had observed McVeigh in OKC on the morning of the bombing said that he had been accompanied by other individuals, and at least one of the individuals described matched initial descriptions of John Doe 2, seen with McVeigh in OKC. Such reports and the many supporting video surveillance tapes that also turned up missing after the FBI took possession of them presented grave problems for the legal defense team, whose client refused to acknowledge that any of these reports could be accurate. More troubling for his defense team was that while on most occasions McVeigh denied that other conspirators existed, at other times during private conversations he alluded to and sometimes even admitted that other individuals had participated in the bombing, and occasionally offering tantalizing tidbits of information to this effect, which, when asked about later, he would deny. Much to McVeigh's consternation, the Jones team continued to implore him to tell them the truth, and numerous investigators were hired and tasked with getting to the bottom of the matter. Over time, Jones team investigator Richard Reyna developed a particularly close relationship with McVeigh, and in doing so uncovered significant information about the bombing plot that, for various reasons, would never come to light. In one internal memo, Reyna informed Jones that based on his investigation and McVeigh's many proven connections to the far right, it is likely that Timothy McVeigh could have been tricked or entrapped by members of the movement to carry out a specific deed, which in the end leaves Mr. McVeigh with the appearance of total responsibility. Years later, Reyna recalled the occasional tantalizing tidbits she shared under the condition that the legal team not point fingers at anybody else, and the implications of his conversations with McVeigh. I spent a lot of time with McVeigh, and he told me a lot of things that I'll take to my grave. He gave me diagrams of where to go and what to see. My job was to find out who he had been dealing with, and that's where I went. Wherever it took me, there were people that should have been brought in that weren't, and those are things that McVeigh and I had talked about. He was never alone, and he was always with several people. All the people that saw him the morning of the bombing definitely identified him, but they identified 4 or 5 people with him. He couldn't have been organizing a 2-car funeral alone. They were painting him to be a general of some sort, but you only had to sit down with him to know he was a frightened kid. McVeigh was just looking for a home, trying with all these different organizations. It can be compared to a war, which is the mentality that the different organizations had. You have soldiers and you have generals and leaders and so forth, and the soldiers followed directions and orders, and that's what McVeigh was doing. End quote. Once, McVeigh told Jones that if no one was arrested for the bombing, the revolution can continue. Once McVeigh told Jones that if no one was arrested for the bombing, the revolution can continue. On another occasion, he said that after Waco and the assault weapons ban, he decided to turn the tide, go on the offensive, and make them know what it feels like to be the hunted, although he refused to specify who we consisted of. During yet another meeting, McVeigh alluded to these mysterious conspirators, since said he had given them his word, and that information was valuable. He then acknowledged having omitted significant information to his defense and said that he had built one lie on top of another. After expressing his regret for doing so, he promised to offer his full cooperation and disclose everything, but warned that if any information was used against anybody else, including Fortier and Nichols, he would not cooperate in the future. McVeigh's newfound spirit of cooperation proved short-lived, however. At various times during conversations with certain members of his defense team, when pressed about the issue of John Doe 2, McVeigh said he hoped to embarrass the government during his trial by exposing the weakness of their investigation and of the bombing, as well as his seemingly contradictory wish that, after all the evidence is heard, the case remains a mystery. As his trial had historical value, and therefore certain details about it must remain secret. Meanwhile, the FBI's statement about the John Doe 2s fluctuated as wildly as McVeigh's until eventually they both removed the mysterious conspirators from the equation completely. According to FBI's official statements to the media, by mid-June 1995, the number of unidentified conspirators had grown to anywhere from 6 to 8 individuals. Within a month, though, the FBI's assertions of a larger plot, or at least their public statements about it, began to change dramatically. On any given day, FBI investigators and spokespeople alternatively acknowledged and denied the existence of John Doe 2 and 3 and 4, and sometimes on the same day. And then suddenly, the FBI began promulgating an entirely new theory that McVeigh's mysterious companions, formerly the subjects of the most intensive manhunt in American history, might never have existed at all and had been the product of well-meaning but mistaken or delusional eyewitnesses. I don't know what's going to play next. I don't want it to be something unrelated to Timothy McVeigh. Yeah, we can do that. There's the Ryder truck. Okay. Well, stupid graphic, to be honest. All right. By July 1995, the FBI called off the search for the John Doe people altogether. This turnaround fed into growing allegations that in the Department of Justice, DOJ's rush to obtain convictions and death sentences for McVeigh and Nichols, the FBI's investigation of additional perpetrators had fallen by the wayside. Is it just this? Or that's crazy. All right, fuck it, whatever. Beyond McVeigh's occasional confidential allusions and cryptic hints, the Jones team found it all the more strange that for someone who claimed to hate the federal government, his version of events shifted in accordance with the latest theories aired publicly by the FBI and prosecutors, a circumstance Stephen Jones described as Kafkaesque. Jones wrote that McVeigh's version of events and the government's went hand in hand, and because McVeigh had regular access to the media and news reports, it became easy for him to adjust his story from time to time to incorporate the government's findings and shore up loose ends when he became aware of them, a practice that Jones said McVeigh had finely honed over the years. For example, to his legal team, McVeigh initially denied seeing anyone else at Elliott's when he came to pick up the Ryder truck. Shortly after the FBI dismissed the sightings, however, Jones asked McVeigh to explain the statements of Elliott's employees who insisted 2 men came in together to rent the Ryder on April 17th. And McVeigh suddenly remembered that indeed another man whom he did not know had come in after him to Elliott's, stood next to him, smoked a cigarette, and even spoke to him briefly. McVeigh, always making friends. In August 1995, a grand jury met at Tinker Air Force Base to hear the government's evidence against McVeigh and Nichols. Media outlets reported that during the supposedly secret but inevitably leaked proceedings, McVeigh's younger sister, Jennifer, had given testimony to the grand jury that alluded to the involvement of a pack of wolves. She said that beginning in December 1993, in a series of conversations and letters with her brother, he confided to her that he had participated in bank robberies with others whom, like him, were at war with the system. We have to fund our wars sometimes with covert means. He compared his actions to those of Robin Hood. The fox or the man version, I wonder. He boasted to her about how he instructed the unnamed bank robbers and showed them how to do it, and had even asked her to launder money, telling her it was proceeds from bank robberies. At least one grand juror, Hoppy Heidelberg, found the proceedings so disturbing that he defied his oath of secrecy and spoke publicly about it, thereby making public some of the information presented. Heidelberg came to feel during the hearings that prosecutors had prevented jurors from hearing crucial evidence and stymied their inquiries and attempts to subpoena it. None of the witnesses who saw the John Does were called to testify, and despite the grand jury's requests, jurors were not permitted to view the surveillance tapes from in and around the Murrah building that claimed to capture the critical moments from in and around critical moments before the blast. Heidelberg further claimed that the FBI had harassed and intimidated several witnesses and pressured them to change their story, an allegation supported by statements of the witnesses themselves as well as the subjects of complaints filed by defense teams. On August 11, 1985, the federal grand jury returned an indictment that read, beginning on or about September 13, 1993, and continuing thereafter until on or about April 19, 1995, McVeigh and Nichols did knowingly, intentionally, willfully, and maliciously conspire, combine, and agree together with others unknown to use a weapon of mass destruction. The indictment listed 27 overt acts that created a narrative of the plot and concluded that McVeigh attempted to recruit others to assist in the violence, a reference to McVeigh's own pre-bombing phone calls and suspicious associations. If they existed at all, the identities of the others unknown mentioned in the indictment remained a mystery, although the phrase itself suggested the possibility of additional arrests. During a press conference explaining the indictments, Janet Reno made the contradictory statement that while the investigation was ongoing, most of the JD2 leads have been pursued and exhausted. Still, while the FBI and prosecution's concerns about John Doe 2 faded rapidly after the grand jury indictment, headlines stressed the case was a puzzle unfinished and far from closed. Jones later wrote that McVeigh and lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler, who earlier threatened to send McVeigh straight to hell, had one thing in common to which they held with an unshakable tenacity. Both publicly professed that Timothy McVeigh was primarily responsible for the bombing. Either way, both were wrong. And either way, both knew they were wrong. During a press conference the day after the indictment was issued, Jones opined that before this investigation is over, the government will have Tim McVeigh standing next to Lee Harvey Oswald. Meanwhile, members of the press as well as the Jones team engaged in a monumental struggle with the government concerning their withholdings of substantial information about the case from defense attorneys, an effort that closely paralleled McVeigh's own obfuscations and Heidelberg's account of government stonewalling during the grand jury. Yeah. All right. Very soon after the bombing, the media's attempts to obtain information about it were somewhat stymied by the court's decision to seal hundreds of case-related documents filed by both prosecution and defense. Major media outlets filed complaints formally objecting to the rules and argued that by doing so, the court violated procedural sealing protocols, the First Amendment, and the public's right to information about criminal trials. Prosecutors maintained that the material fell under the 1980 Classified Information Procedures Act and therefore was outside the scope of public disclosure. Despite its close relationships to the press, the Jones team objected to unsealing the document. Referring to the sealed material and other limits placed on the public's access to information about the case, USA Today remarked that while the bombing was the most public of crimes, the man accused of committing it is getting the most secret of trials. Despite the advantage this afforded to the government, who can't always be trusted to do what's right. While the Jones team agreed the documents should be sealed, the government's secrecy became a major and ongoing point of contention between them and the prosecution and the subject of many Jones team court filings. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution dictates that prosecutors provide defense attorneys with material in the government's possession considered exculpatory to a defendant in the criminal trial per Brady versus Maryland. Included in this is information and evidence that could influence possible conviction for a crime and sentencing. I'm getting to the end here. Sentencing level of culpability, such as physical evidence and witness statements that contradict prosecutors' charges, which would impeach a prosecution witness or reflect their status as a paid informant. 6 months after the bombing, on November 6, 1995, the Jones team submitted its first request for such material to the DA's office, noting that the government had not yet provided with them any exculpatory evidence gathered during the FBI's investigation. Only after Judge Match ordered them to begin handing over discovery materials to the defense in a timely manner did prosecutors begin incremental and partial production of the material. Jones quickly realized that significant reports were missing, including those pertaining to critical eyewitnesses, such as the Elliots and Dreamland witnesses. According to Roger Charles, the government's delays and omissions were always most pronounced on the issue of possible conspirators. Rob Nye said it didn't matter how specific we were. The government's response was that everything had to be provided. The back and forth between the prosecution and defense continued until the time of McVeigh's trial and after its conclusion. Perhaps the most notable instance of withheld material concerned the surveillance footage from the camera's positions outside the Murrah building. Yeah, I'm wondering about that. The Murrah building that the FBI had confiscated immediately after the blast. At the very least, the footage had the potential of clearing up some of the lingering questions about who was with McVeigh the morning of the bombing. However, despite the legal efforts of the Jones team, survivors and victims of the bombing, investigators for a county grand jury, and the media, the contents of the tapes remain secret, or at least officially. In late October, the Associated Press reported that, according to federal law enforcement officials, while the footage showed a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the passenger seat of a Ryder truck, because of the quality of the image was poor, investigators were unable to determine the identity of the passenger. Referring to John Doe 2, one article opined, it says, it's like he walked into the wall and vanished. Nevertheless, Judge Match ruled that an order forcing the government to produce the missing surveillance tapes would not only interfere with the operations of law enforcement agencies, but that public release of the tapes would hamper with ongoing criminal proceedings. Only after the criminal trial of McVeigh had concluded did a Secret Service memo written immediately after the bombing come to surface. The memo stated that security tapes from the area found around the Murrah show the truck detonation 3 minutes and 6 seconds after the suspects exit the truck. While the FBI and federal prosecutors continued to deny the existence of such footage, a memo, later permitted into entry as evidence during Terry Nichols' 2004 state trial, was described by Nichols' defense team as direct evidence of the involvement of others in the bombing conspiracy. For many, including the Jones team and Stephen Jones particularly, that other yet unidentified suspects existed was the only way to make sense of not just of the eyewitness accounts, but also many of the unexplained calls McVeigh made to suspicious groups and people prior to the bombing, and critical gaps of unexplained time in his and the FBI's timeline of the plot. McVeigh's own obfuscations and changing stories seem nonsensical no matter how he spun it on any given day. Among his shifting stories, his prior involvement in other crimes, the nature of his relationship to the white power movement generally, and the residents of Elohim City and their associates specifically, the actual number of identities of his accomplices, the aliases and disguises he used, the extent to which he conducted surveillance of the Murrah before April 19th, and his ignorance of the daycare center, the exact geographic locations and movements of McVeigh and the Ryder from the time the bomb was allegedly being built in Kansas until the moment it exploded, and amazingly, even the clothes he wore the day of the bombing. Thus, in order to make sense of all the conflicting information, the Jones team cataloged and constructed a chronology of McVeigh's contradictory statements, a document that eventually came to over 500 pages. For Jones, McVeigh's statements, which read together and closely scrutinized, inadvertently confirmed the existence of John Doe 2. Jones explained to me that McVeigh simply realized that he told me too much. He hadn't given me a name, but he told me too much. One internal defense memo entitled, "Is he lying or isn't he?" Secret. Discussed their efforts, reminded those on the legal team that McVeigh had occasionally admitted to being deceptive with them, outlined his contradictory statements, and concluded that McVeigh's lone bomber story was riddled with inconsistencies. The larger part of McVeigh's adult life was predicated upon lies, deceptions, cons, and thefts. Every person has the capacity for self-deception, but Tim's is seemingly infinite. Jones said that after realizing the extent of his obfuscations, I then went to McVeigh and asked him how he wanted to be remembered. As a mastermind, a terrorist? Who's going to challenge you? Certainly not the government or the people you're protecting. The only people challenging McVeigh were his own lawyers. A number of angry letters about the issue flew back and forth between McVeigh and Jones, but the team's pleas that he tell them the truth only resulted in increasingly hostile interactions with McVeigh. Finally, McVeigh consented to Jones's request that he submit a polygraph test to resolve the John Doe issue. But the results of the test suggested that, while he was honest in his claims of having participated, McVeigh was dishonest in his insistence that no additional accomplices were involved beyond the limited participation and foreknowledge of Fortier and Nichols. Tim Domgard, who issued the test, said that he had absolutely no doubt that McVeigh was concealing the identity of another person involved in the situation, and predicted that McVeigh would take the name with him to his grave. When Jones confronted him about the results, McVeigh became enraged. In a series of angry handwritten letters to his defense team, McVeigh wrote that the only way he could continue to cooperate with them was if they accepted his lone wolf claims, and, referring to all other theories of the case, instructed them to just drop it. The ongoing concerns about his truthfulness led to the complete deterioration of the already strained relationship between McVeigh and Jones, and he informed members of his defense team that since he and Jones had reached an impasse and his efforts to resolve this had been unsuccessful, he was going to have to resort to guerrilla warfare with Jones, and threatened to plead guilty if the defense team did not stop their investigation. Beliefs that others had participated still did not explain the minute details of the crime, and the team considered several possibilities of what could have happened, all of which became variants of the story types discussed in this book. Jones' team attorney Bob Wyatt outlined a handful of these possibilities. McVeigh acted alone, with others, had been contracted by a group of right-wing fanatics, or recruited by foreigners. The government or friends of the government recruited a guy who thinks the bombing was a payback for Waco, when in fact the real objective was to overshadow and justify the actions by the government at Waco and discredit the Waco group and supporters as a bunch of nuts. In other words, the Manchurian Candidate scenario. McVeigh bristled, especially at the allegations that someone had used him as an experimental wolf, and told Jones, "I haven't been brainwashed. I did this for the movement." Fascinating. I haven't been brainwashed. I did this for the movement. You can argue with that, you know? Okay. Referring to a meeting between defense team members, Jones' team attorney Dick Burr wrote in another internal memo, quote, "The significance of the evidence that Tim did not act alone, and the possibility that he may not have been the general, and the relationship of these facts to Tim's compulsion to convince us that he acted alone, with only fading support from Fortier and Nichols, informed much of our subsequent discussion. The following should aid in the contours of the defense. Tim was not acting alone at the Murrah building. He may not have been the primary actor. Indeed, he may not have had a primary role at all. His role may have been far less important than he has led us to believe. He may have driven the truck, he may not have. He may have been only the getaway car or decoy driver. He may in fact have been the fall guy, who, though involved enough in the conspiracy and the bombing himself to be convicted, may have less culpability than the government's theory, as well as his own story now assigns him. As credible evidence to this end mounts that other, as yet disclosed people were involved, there is a risk that Tim will decompensate. If he is no longer perceived credibly as the primary actor, the view of himself as competent and valuable may fade. His fear of this happening may account for the passionate pleas he has made to all of us every now and then to just or finally believe me." Eventually, mental health experts hired by the Jones team to evaluate and treat McVeigh concluded that he was not likely the person who came up with the idea for the bombing, but that he could have very well been the person who took responsibility for carrying it out. His strength is in carrying out orders. However, given McVeigh's agitation about both ongoing mental health evaluations and findings, as well as defense team's investigatory attempts, they recommended the Jones team consider not pushing Tim any further about whether he is lying to us. Jones, however, chose not to heed the advice and doggedly continued his investigation, and McVeigh began referring to him as Sherlock Jones. It was Jones's opinion that a defensible argument could be constructed to show that the government withheld evidence about the bombing from the defense, the courts, and the American people. evidence which suggests not that McVeigh was innocent, but that he was involved in a much larger conspiracy. Nevertheless, even among those on the Jones team who suspected McVeigh was shielding the identities of others, not all agreed with Jones's planned strategy of proving a larger conspiracy at the upcoming trial. Some found information about others unknown inconsequential, and perhaps even detrimental to a defense case, including attorney Christopher Tritico, who later stated that, quite frankly, my view of the other conspirators, was that proving he had someone else helping him only gets him and someone else executed. It doesn't win the case. In order to win the case, we needed to forget about this other guy, even if he existed. The fact that Tim didn't answer some of the questions Stephen wanted him to answer, those were questions that I would have never asked him in the first place. That's freaking crazy. Sorry, there's 20 pages left in the prologue. I would like to finish it. What time is it? 3 o'clock? Okay, we can do this in an hour. In under an hour. Even. The Oklahoma dissidents dancing with the devil. Acts of terrorism are complex and multi-layered, and those who survive them have equally complex reactions. Although not often acknowledged, those who survive the trauma of terroristic violence must also contend with state legal and media institutions whose policies sometimes lead to further traumatization. In order to regain equilibrium or make sense of nonsensical events, victims take the available fragments of information about the event and use them to construct a survivor's narrative. Victims undergo additional compounded traumatization when critical information remains unknown, a situation that prevents them from constructing a believable narrative about their own pain. The most salient need for information was experienced by the bombing's survivors and victims' family members, many of whom later recounted their early and ongoing reliance on the media to provide it. Coinciding with Jones's struggle with the FBI and prosecutors over the discovery material and reflective of the larger struggle for information about the case and the control of this information, was the parallel struggle of a group of survivors and victim family members whom Ambrose Evans Pritchard dubbed the Oklahoma City dissidents. Since the bombing, the dissidents had become increasingly alarmed about what they perceived to be the FBI's incremental abandonment of its search for other conspirators, and the DOJ's lack of concern over prosecuting them. They became increasingly vocal in the media about their lingering questions. The dissidents wondered, was there a larger conspiracy? Did anyone who could have warned the victims, even federal law enforcement officials, know of the plot beforehand? Was a government informer involved? In November 1995, led by Oklahoma State Representative Charles Key, the dissidents petitioned to form and panel a state grand jury investigation to uncover new information about the bombing plot, and if possible, identify other conspirators. While the dissidents were eventually successful in impaneling the jury, they faced significant and heavy-handed institutional resistance in doing so. Prosecutors and officials publicly accused the dissidents in engaging in paranoid delusions and, quote, pandering to the worst kind of paranoid conspiracy theories, unquote. News reports and editorials repeatedly echoed such sentiments, quoting experts, officials, and watchdog groups who compared the suspicions and speculations of the dissidents and others about the bombing case to Holocaust denial, and claimed that such expressions were indicative of the same delusional extremism that had created the ideological atmosphere for the bombing in the first place. Thus, the dissidents were equated symbolically with Timothy McVeigh himself. In an ironic twist foreshadowing many more to come, those most deeply impacted by the bombing, an act committed by a crazed conspiracy theorist, were now themselves labeled conspiracy theorists. Nevertheless, the dissidents gained popular support and were featured in an ABC News segment of 2020 that highlighted some of the known and missing evidence that fueled and the growing speculations, rumors, and theories. In two opinion polls at this time, 80 to 90% of Oklahomans favored the formation of the grand jury. 13,500 Oklahoma City residents signed the petition, and 5,000 more required by state law. 5,000 more than required by state law. After a lengthy and bitty public campaign and appeals process, the Oklahoma Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of the formation of the grand jury. However, while Key would head the investigation to the dismay of the dissidents, Oklahoma City Oklahoma District Attorney Robert Macy, lead prosecutor in both McVeigh's and Nichols' trials, and the most aggressive opponent of the grand jury's formation, was appointed to oversee the grand jury's hearings and determine what information could be presented. Classic. Love that. And I'm frozen. And I'm frozen. Oh. Okay. Okay, after a lengthy so they have that guy. Nevertheless, he established the OKC bombing investigation, made up of volunteers and professional research staff who would conduct their own investigation and gather evidence. Kathy Wilburn Sanders, whose 2 grandsons had died in the bombing, became one of the most outspoken dissidents. She wrote that the group's need for answers was so overwhelming that they were willing to dance with the devil to get the truth. For the dissidents, the devil resided in the details. Evan Pritchard wrote, "Documents have a habit of leaking when friendships are formed across a broad front. And therefore, in order to solve the mystery, the dissidents formed an unholy alliance with a number of individuals and groups. The alliance, which traded information like baseball cards, included the Jones team, victims' families, sympathetic investigative journalists, fringe conspiracy theorists, and the mainstream media, all of whom were pursuing similar lines of inquiry about the facts surrounding the bombing. The unlikely hodgepodge of Allied truth seekers painstakingly retraced the steps McVeigh had allegedly taken on his road to right-wing extremism. Along the way, they encountered the vast network of parties with whom McVeigh had crossed paths and possibly conspired. Like the research communities that sprang up around the JFK assassination, the OKCBIC tapped an enormous but obscure knowledge base and gathered, compiled, and categorized a wealth of previously unknown information pertaining to the bombing plot. The information uncovered additional wrinkles of complexity in the already complex situation that, although often raising questions more than it answered, proved irrefutably damning to the government's story. The combined investigatory efforts led to revelations about its prior knowledge of the bombing and shed light on the possible identities of several other conspirators. Among the most publicized of these revelations were those concerning McVeigh's relationship to the cast of characters residing in or frequently visiting Elohim City, including Andres Strassmeyer, Andy the German, a German national living in the U.S. on an expired visa and head of the paramilitary training at Elohim City. Elohim City had only one telephone that was shared by the entire community. Residents remembered that on April 5, 1995, 2 weeks before the bombing, McVeigh called looking for Strassmeyer. McVeigh, Strassmeyer, the FBI, and prosecutors maintained that the two met at a Tulsa gun show 2 years earlier, in April 1993, at which point Strassmeyer invited McVeigh, who introduced himself as Tim Tuttle, to the community. Then, on April 17, 1995, and again on April 18th, McVeigh called CAUSE, C-A-U-S-E, the racist legal organization that represented Strassmeyer. Although an FBI memo dated April 20th, 1995, the day after the bombing, stated it is suspected that members of the Elohim City are involved in the bombing, either directly or indirectly through conspiracy, no real investigation into these links was conducted, and Strassmeyer was questioned only by telephone and only after he had been allowed to leave the country and return to Germany. Nevertheless, these suspicions about him persisted. According to Roger Charles, a number of strange details and circumstances surrounding his life suggest that Strassmeyer was not the radical right-winger he appeared to be, and might even have been a government agent of some kind, spying on extremists in the United States. Over the years, Strassmeyer spoke to a handful of journalists. In 1997, while denying his involvement in the bombing, he told Evans Pritchard that the bombing was a sting operation permeated by undercover agents and informants that acquired a momentum of its own. Strassmeyer elaborated, and quote, "The ATF, FBI, and different agencies weren't cooperating. In fact, they were working against each other. You even had a situation where one branch of the FBI was investigating and not sharing with another branch. The ATF had something going on with McVeigh. They were watching him, of course they were. McVeigh knew he was delivering a bomb, but he had no idea what was in the truck. He just wanted to shake things up a little, make a gesture. The bomb was never meant to explode. They were going to arrest McVeigh at the site with the bomb in hand, but he didn't come at the right time. Maybe he changed the time. You never know with people who are so unreliable. I have heard that they were expecting the bomb to go off in the middle of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning. The truck had a transmitter so they could track it with a radio receiving device. I don't know how they could have lost contact. I think there was misinformation that the operation had been canceled. When asked if he thought the agents and informants would reveal themselves, Strassmeyer responded, "How can he? Ooh. What happens if it was a sting operation from the beginning? What happens if it comes out that the plant was a provocateur? What if he talked and manipulated the others into it? What then? The country couldn't handle it. The relatives of the victims are going crazy, and he's going to be responsible for the murder of 168 people? Of course, the informant can't come forward. He's scared shitless right now." The dissident truth seekers also discovered connections between McVeigh and a group of Elohim City associates who called themselves the Aryan Republican Army, and dubbed by the press the Midwest Bank Robbers. Considered one of the most criminally competent paramilitary gangs in American history, between 1993 and 1995, the ARA robbed 22 banks, netting over $250,000 in proceeds. The ultimate goal of the ARA's bank robberies was to fund and incite a race war, spark a revolution, and establish an all-white homeland. They could go to Israel. When the area was apprehended, a mountain of bomb-making materials were found in their safe house. McVeigh denied any association, but his movements throughout the country in the years leading to the bombing were often closely overlapped with those of the ARA, and in the years leading up to the bombing, he'd written his sister letters telling her he was involved with a group of bank robbers. Although a few of the bank robbers would allude to ARA participation in the bombing plot, and there was physical and circumstantial evidence linking certain members of the ARA with the bombing, the FBI improperly destroyed some of it, failed to look closely at the bank robbers' alibis on April 19, 1995, and ultimately shut down their investigation into the connection. Sorry. Wilmer and Sanders wrote that as the dissidents' investigation advanced, it was becoming clear that there was much we didn't know, and the people who were supposed to be on our side might be harboring some unthinkable secrets. Still, the incestuous sharing of information between the grand jury investigators, Jones' team, dissidents, and investigative journalists continued to yield results. Perhaps the most startling were revelations about Carol Howe, H-O-W-E, a paid informant for the ATF and the FBI, who had, from June 1994 until June 1995, infiltrated Elohim City and the ARA, and other groups in the ATF investigation deemed significant/sensitive, meaning it had the potential national security implications. Ho, who had become deeply embedded within the community of extremists, filed over 70 reports with her ATF handlers, and on numerous occasions warned them about an impending attack on April 19th, the anniversary of the fire at Waco, and named Andres Strassmeyer and some of the ARA bank robbers among them as conspirators. In one report submitted prior to the OKC bombing, Ho specifically named the Murrah Federal Building as one of the three possible targets for a bombing being considered by the conspirators, and reported she had on 3 occasions accompanied them to scout out the Murrah. She passed all of 17 polygraph tests the ATF had given her to substantiate her information. Immediately after the bombing, Ho reported to the ATF and FBI that she had seen McVeigh at Elohim City on more than one occasion in the year prior to the bombing. Corroborating her claims were a number of other undercover informants placed within the Elohim City by federal agencies and watchdog groups, including the Southern Poverty Law Center, who independently said they saw McVeigh there on over a dozen occasions. In fact, the dissidents' unholy alliance led to revelations about the prevalence of federal informants embedded within or very near to the bombing plot, of whom Ho was not the only one. Evans Pritchard wrote, "The intrigue had become so twisted with undercover informants from different agencies tripping over each other that it is also impossible to disentangle." Thus emerged the story of the closely watched wolves. In 1996, based on information developed by the committee and its allies, 475 survivors and victims' family members began filing what would amount to several civil law and wrongful law death suits, as well as other legal actions initiated against government agencies, including the ATF and the FBI. The plaintiffs charged that those named in the suits had failed to act on the warnings of informants and argued that the bombing had occurred amidst a sting operation, and thus the government agencies involved were partially culpable for the deaths that occurred. A mainstay within all later closely watched Wolves stories. The courts dismissed these lawsuits. The Jones team and key investigators spoke with numerous individuals who said the FBI interviewed them regarding McVeigh, his associates, and possible co-conspirators, but that reports documenting these interviews had not been among the discovery information furnished by the FBI. Further, a growing number of people with crucial information about the bombing plot said the FBI expressly instructed them not to speak to the defense team, harassed them, and ordered them to destroy any notes they had taken about what they knew or witnessed. Still others reported that they had been harassed and ridiculed or subjected to other FBI methods meant to prevent them from coming forward with the information. Many were scared for their jobs and reputations. Charles Key recounted, quote, "I did get some personal threats, and I don't feel comfortable talking about that. I think the real threats were from people like the Attorney General, who had the power to try and stop people from doing what they have the right to do, investigate. That's a real threat. There were many efforts behind the scenes to try and smear us in some way. An effort to try to do anything possible to try and discredit us. The Assistant Attorney General was trying to control the grand jury. Robert Macy, who was tasked with presenting evidence, was trying to fight us every step of the way. We knew the deck was stacked against us. One of the most frustrating things was the issue of prior knowledge. It was clear there was prior knowledge. Someone knew something was in the works, and when we asked questions about this, we were attacked. We had information from a Senate staffer. I interviewed him, and he claimed the Justice Department was involved in a sting operation. It was never meant to get out of hand or develop to the point it went. The sting went down the wrong path. They covered it up, he said, because the operation went bad. One of the most frustrating things was we were accused of saying the government blew the building up, which I did not say. I do not believe that. There is a difference between a sting operation that has gone wrong and thinking the government did it. The question is, how much prior knowledge did they have? Roger Charles later wrote that the prosecution was worried about the large number of witnesses who recalled seeing McVeigh with others, and so, with the help of a handful of trusted FBI agents, they set about making the problems go away. They interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses, looking for weaknesses in their stories or ways to get them to change their minds. Included were lead FBI agents Scott Mendeloff and John Hursley's extensive efforts to neutralize Elliott employees, convince them that John Doe too was a phantom, and thereby prevent the spectral conspirator from appearing at the trials. In fact, Hursley was the prosecution's go-to person to resolve many of the holes in the case. Lead prosecutor Larry Mackey later acknowledged that Hursley's regularly hammered witnesses who might aid the defense team's cases. Further, another FBI agent in the case, Danny Deffenbaugh, disclosed that in his opinion, Hursley commonly distorted evidence, lied about the investigation or lack thereof, and often acted outside of his authority. We had to go to watch over John. He'd go around trying to stop viable investigations, especially if they involved other people in the conspiracy. Every time we caught him, I had to bring him in the woodshed to paddle him, then we'd go right back at it. Okay. What's more, it appeared that the FBI was making other evidence disappear. For instance, on November 1995, the Jones team requested transcripts of the OKCPD and OKCFD dispatch tapes of the transmissions in the 2 weeks prior to the bombing and the day of April 19th. Rather than honoring this request, later discovery material would show that the FBI had accidentally destroyed these dispatch tapes. This was not the only instance of such shenanigans. Thus, nearly a year after they had submitted the first request, Jones informed Match that the government had not complied with Match's earlier order to turn over discovery material and that the defense team continued to learn of efforts by the government to conceal and destroy exculpatory evidence and to obstruct the defense investigation of the facts and of the case. He compared the case and the struggle to obtain the information to Alice in Wonderland, where nothing is as it seems, and nobody means exactly what they say. Jones submitted a 400-page list of still missing information, including that uncovered by the dissidents and key investigators, as well as still classified reports. Saying that the list represented only the tip of the iceberg and accurately foretold that unless the situation was rectified, much exculpatory evidence will never be known to the defense. Prosecutors insisted that they had already turned over all the materials, had even exceeded the discovery obligations, and accused the defense of going on a fishing expedition. Much to McVeigh's displeasure, an undeterred Jones team filed a motion with the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals arguing that there was a high probability that Strassmeyer and other individuals at Elohim City were part of the bombing conspiracy, but that the government had engaged in a willful and knowing cover-up of information supplied by its informant. Ultimately, though, Match denied Jones's pleas to compel the prosecution to comply with the discovery rules, and Match's earlier order that they do so, ruling that Howe's testimony was irrelevant. And that even if the defense had all of the government's information regarding or relating to Elohim City, other suspected conspirators, and everything else it sought, he would deem it inadmissible to trial. Only after the criminal trial concluded did the Jones team learn the extent to which the FBI failed to turn over discoverable exculpatory materials. Further revelations of withheld information continue to this day, as explained in the final chapter. Excuse me. All right. I've got like 10 pages left. 12, maybe. I hope someone is watching and enjoying this. I actually have no idea. But this is a good book. Okay. The good ship McVeigh. If Jones or McVeigh's media strategies had in any way softened the public perception of McVeigh, such progress was lost when on March 1st, 1997, just weeks before his trial began, the Dallas Morning News ran yet another front-page leaked confession story, which was then picked up by several other major news outlets, whose front-page exclusives included yet more leaked material. McVeigh blamed Jones for the breach, and Jones, after alternatively blaming various members of the defense team, settled on publicly pointing the finger at Richard Reyna, the defense attorney closest to McVeigh. Reyna, in turn, denied the accusation and went on to publicly blame Jones. No matter who had leaked this time, other members of the Jones team felt that the Dallas Morning News article was simply unavoidable culmination of Jones's unwise relationship with the media that had plagued their efforts since the get-go. Legal experts opined that the continuous Jones team leaks had done more damage to McVeigh than the government's own case against him. Jones team attorney Coyne later wrote that after the article, our Hindenburg of hope had vaporized, and Jones's media campaign imploded with a vengeance. In my view, the good ship McVeigh had run ashore on the shoals of its captain's ego. Jones had been hosted up by his own petard. Okay. The conflict ensued, said Coyne, made the shootout at the OK Corral look like a simple misunderstanding. When McVeigh found out about the morning news leak, he had nothing short of a total conniption fit. Defense attorney Tritico said, the media leak sent Tim over the top, and quite frankly, I don't blame him. It was devastating to the defense right before the trial. McVeigh then attempted to have Jones removed from the case based on such mismanagement, but he was unsuccessful, due largely to Jones's own thwarting of McVeigh's efforts. When he failed to get Jones fired, McVeigh threatened to plead guilty. In response to the threat, Jones wrote McVeigh a letter reminding him that many members of the defense team felt that McVeigh's version of the story, while possible, was neither probable nor likely, and warned that if McVeigh attempted to plead guilty, Jones would inform Judge Match that McVeigh was simply attempting to take the fall for other conspirators. In another letter, referring to McVeigh's many references to his personal code of honor, Jones chided McVeigh, if by code of honor you mean we are to protect other murdering bastards, that is not something that we have any obligation to do. Certainly no one is protecting you. You have been thrown to the wolves. All right, and quote, in order for you to play a useful role in your own defense, you need to eliminate the fiction that you are some self-contained individual capable fully of controlling your own destiny and actions. It has come time at last to grow up and recognize fully what is at stake here. We are trying to save your ass. Your version of events, placing 99% of the responsibility of the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building upon yourself, you claim to have conceived the project conceived the project, organized it, financed it, thought it through, and then carried it out. In your discussions with us, nothing is left to chance and everything was perfectly executed, including having been intentionally apprehended afterwards. The details you offer to support this story simply appear to be irreconcilable with the facts and simply cannot be reconciled with the known physical evidence and eyewitnesses, unless we are willing to believe that not just simply one or two, but dozens of individuals are honestly mistaken. What you are doing is protecting fellow conspirators. You simply have not told us the truth. I think it is entirely possible, perhaps even probable, that much of what you have told us, in fact, the truth, but the part that is not the truth may be the most critical part, the role of others. It is the responsibility of attorneys to investigate not only the facts, but to investigate beyond what the client has said or represented, and nothing you can say or do can distract us from this duty. You can write to whomever you wish complaining about me, though it is clearly ill-advised. End quote. Jones warned that if he did not give up his fictions, McVeigh would eventually break down physically, emotionally, and mentally, and concluded the letter by outlining his predictions about the future of McVeigh's trial and legacy, which Jones said were likely no matter what McVeigh or his legal team did or did not do. The reality is, of course, that the odds are you will be found condemned not only by the verdict of the jury, but by the verdict of the American people, history, your family, and that you will be executed and put to death. Not with honor, because you will be perceived as a mass murderer, a man who committed a crime greater than Lee Harvey Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, or Ted Bundy. Not only will you die, but many of the principles you believe in will, at least temporarily, be rejected by the American people, and you will be seen as a fanatical, maladjusted misfit who brought untold suffering to thousands of people in your misguided attempt to right an imaginary wrong by resorting to revolutionary terror. You will be equated in the public's mind not with Patrick Henry, but with Adolf Hitler. Okay. The Trial and Tribulations of Timothy McVeigh. In her 2012 book, Killing McVeigh, Jodi Madeira illustrates how McVeigh's trial was a site of narrative construction and negotiation for victims, survivors, the state, and the larger public, which at its conclusion would offer a solidified, officially sanctioned, and publicly acceptable collective version of history. Similarly to the contention between McVeigh and Jones, as well as that between Jones, the dissidents, and the government, the trial of Timothy McVeigh represented a struggle of who exactly could recount the past. Like the key grand jury, McVeigh's trial was an institutional ceremony to resolve lingering ambiguity and contested truths about the bombing, not the least of which was John Doe 2. By the time jury selection began for the trial of the United States versus Timothy McVeigh on March 31st, 1997, the government had eliminated John Doe 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 as a factor in the case, dismissing him/them as a product of witnesses' confusion and unconscious transference. The week before, the Washington Post observed that in a case where each hard fact is surrounded by theory, speculation, or spin, the shadowy John Doe 2 would, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, remain eternally at large. The one who got away, the mystery man at the center of countless conspiracy theories. It's possible he never lived. It's likely that he will never die. He had become a legend delegated to the reality of myth, to the realm of myth, where truth is not only impossible to ascertain, it's almost irrelevant. Still, despite the assurances of prosecutors that the FBI had followed every possible lead in an intensive effort to identify and bring to justice everyone involved, for many, including the dissidents and a significant portion of the American public, doubts persisted. A 1997 Times/CNN poll found that 77% of Americans believed that the FBI had not yet captured or identified all bombing conspirators, and a Gallup poll reported similar results, as well as another belief held by a considerable percentage of Americans that the federal government was itself involved in the bombing. Some chalked up the persistent belief in John Doe 2 to the inability of people to accept that one man, with a little but not much help from his friends, could commit such an atrocity. Others blamed increasing public cynicism and distrust in the government that had become common after the JFK assassination, Vietnam, Watergate, and Iran-Contra. Public confidence in the criminal justice system and law enforcement agencies generally, and the FBI especially, had sharply declined in the wake of Ruby Ridge, Waco, the first World Trade Center bombing, OKC, and the Atlanta Olympic bombings, and a recent FBI crime lab scandal. At stake in the trial of Timothy McVeigh was the public's trust and confidence in long-standing government institutions, and McVeigh's guilty verdict could potentially act as a powerful remedy for the crisis of legitimacy caused by the FBI's ongoing foul-ups, mishaps, and cover-ups. Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating, a former FBI agent and staunch opponent of both the Key grand jury and theories about John Doe II, confidently told reporters, quote, "We believe the system should work and will work, and those responsible for this horrific act will never walk the face of this earth again." For him, the willingness of Americans, what the hell? For him, the willingness of Americans to believe that our free institutions can commonly be corrupted by dark and evil purposes was a result of watching too many Oliver Stone movies. What we see on the movie screens these days demonizes government agencies and public officials. Free institutions cannot survive this kind of cynicism. In fact, Keating continued, the bombing itself was a result of just such paranoia. Guilty verdicts in criminal trials help exorcise social demons and retroactively or preemptively legitimize institutional responses to them. The bombing had unleashed an abundance of previously dormant or clandestine threats, including racists, militias, gun nuts, and conspiracy theorists, who posed a danger to peace-loving Americans and who had quickly come to represent an emergent, homegrown, domestic terrorist specter. Since the time of his arrest, media coverage had linked McVeigh to militias, conspiracy theorists, and a number of others said to be allied within a loose network of autonomous anti-government groups who inhabited the semi-underground world of gun shows and remote compounds. These apocalyptic millennialists reportedly ranted and raved about black helicopters, government concentration camps for the politically incorrect, implantable microchips, the New World Order, spaceships, and sometimes the Zionist-controlled media. Many feared the viral spread of their dangerous ideas. Experts warned journalists that America's extremists, defined as militia members and conspiracy theorists of all stripes, would be watching the trial closely for details that supported their crazy theories, anti-government or otherwise. Information that would then absolutely flood that subculture and potentially spark another McVeigh. On the other hand, if McVeigh was found guilty, the government could send a clear message to racists, terrorists, militia members, and other anti-government zealots that their beliefs had no place in society, and demonstrate to the rest of the world that acts of terrorism on American soil would not be tolerated. Opening arguments commenced on April 24th. It was the most covered criminal trial in the 20th century and an absolute circus. For 9 weeks, more than 2,000 media representatives from every major outlet swarmed Denver and swamped the airwaves with round-the-clock daily coverage, in-studio recaps of the previous 2 years, on-location commentary, up-to-the-minute updates, legal analysis, and speculations about the outcome. In an attempt to avoid the frenzied circus atmosphere that plagued the O.J. Simpson trial, Judge Match banned cameras from filming inside the courtroom and relegated journalists to an area outside the courthouse known as the bullpen. We love the bullpen. Still each day, the courtroom quickly filled with beyond its maximum capacity. Security measures in and around the courtroom were intense. During the trial, federal prosecutors told the lone wolf story with a little help from his friend Nichols. They emphasized McVeigh's anti-government views and asserted that while Nichols had offered minimal assistance by gathering materials and building the bomb, McVeigh alone had conceived of, planned, and carried out the bombing by driving alone to OKC and detonating the bomb truck. According to prosecutors, while it was true that both Nichols and Fortier agreed to help McVeigh, it was also true they did so only because he had intimidated and threatened them until both, to differing extents, backed out, leaving McVeigh to execute the final stages of his plan by himself. Prosecutors attributed McVeigh's motive to bomb the Murrah to his hatred of the government and rage about the 80 Branch Davidians killed at Waco. The Jones team attorney, Randy Coyne, observed, as many others would, the efficiency and brevity of the prosecution's case. The government kept their case simple, lean, and mean. They got in and got out and didn't seem to prove anything and didn't present a complete story. They certainly weren't interested in cluttering ate up with alternative theories, and Tim was not interested in sharing responsibility if that meant reducing his culpability. Jones touched upon aspects of McVeigh's desired necessity defense, which revolved around the argument that the actions at Waco had required him to bomb the Murrah, but mainly attempted to poke holes in the prosecution's case and alluded that McVeigh had simply been a designated patsy within a larger conspiracy. Judge Match, however, ruled that much of the eyewitness testimony and physical evidence, or lack thereof, that Jones wanted to use was inadmissible, thereby severely hampering his ability to raise questions in the mind of the jurors about the others unknown. Among the absent witnesses whose testimony was ruled inadmissible were those who saw McVeigh at Elliott's Dreamland, Geary Lake, where the bomb was allegedly built, and Oklahoma City, all of whom saw him with other individuals collectively referred to as John Doe 2. Prosecutors dismissed as confused the statements of the many Dreamland witnesses who saw not only another unidentified man with McVeigh, but also another Ryder truck prior to the Elliott's rental. Despite numerous eyewitness statements and other evidence to the contrary, prosecutors emphasized that there was only one truck used in the bombing plot and told jurors that there was no indication that McVeigh had rented a second truck. Jones was unable to introduce evidence showing otherwise. McVeigh, of course, could not have been more pleased by Judge Match's rulings and, of course, told his attorneys so, chiding that for the past 18 months they had ignored his requests that they stop pursuing others unknown as John Doe's, and he did not take the stand for his own defense. I'm sorry. 8 pages left, and then I'll stop. All right. While their testimony was ruled inadmissible, Jones was able to discuss the testimony given to the FBI by several eyewitnesses who had reported seeing McVeigh and another person in the days leading up to the bombing with him in the Ryder the morning of April 19th. When taken together, he argued, they provide a picture dramatically different than the one the government will present. Jones remarked that it defied logic to think that McVeigh, whom the government said had carefully plotted his terror for 2 years, would register at Dreamland's motel under his own name, but use an alias to rent the Ryder from Elliott's, only miles away. He then called attention to the fact that several people had access to McVeigh's phone card, and therefore it was impossible to prove who exactly made many of the incriminating calls, such as those placed to Elliott's while the Ryder was reserved. Although there were up to 25 surveillance cameras positioned in and around the Murrah building on April 19th, the FBI never produced them during discovery, nor did they enter them as evidence at the criminal trials. The whereabouts of the footage from all of 25 of these known surveillance cameras remain unknown, and Match did not compel the FBI to produce them. Judge Match. Amazingly, as one of these witnesses who saw McVeigh in the days leading up to the bombing and on the morning of April 19th testified, assumingly because they all saw him with other people. And since the surveillance tapes from the Murrah never surfaced, and while nobody argued otherwise, prosecutors never even established McVeigh's presence in OKC on the morning of the 19th. Roger Charles opined that despite the FBI's protestations about leaving no stone unturned, by June 1995, only weeks into the investigation, the government had settled on the case they planned to present, which, for him, was notable for what it left out, as it was for the oddly truncated version it presented as the whole story. Jones remarked that the factual part of the government's case was pared down to a minimum, and it went fast, like a film that's been edited to jump cut pace, presumably so no one would notice its gaps and inconsistencies. It was daring, it was high risk. Who would ever have guessed that a case already highly circumstantial, in which the federal government was asking for the death penalty, would leave the jury without a single witness to Tim's whereabouts? Physical evidence introduced during the trial was scarce and dubious. Criminologist and former Jones team consultant Mark Ham observed that the government's lone wolf theory failed to explain how the bomb was built, transported to Oklahoma City, and discharged. A DOJ Inspector General inspection and audit report issued months earlier had strongly criticized the FBI's crime laboratory for mishandling evidence in high-profile cases, including but not limited to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, an assassination attempt on George H.W. Bush that same year, the 1995 investigation of Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, and the Oklahoma City bombing. The IG, the Inspector Generals, initiated its investigation after the supervisory special agent in the FBI crime lab, Frederick Whitehurst, PhD, considered the FBI's most highly qualified bomb residue and explosives expert, went public with allegations about corrupt crime lab practices. The IG final report concluded, among other things, that the OKC bombing investigation was one of the most serious cases of evidence tampering that the Inspector General had ever encountered, and that the FBI crime lab had repeatedly reached conclusions that incriminated the defendants without scientific basis. The FBI lab reports for the OKC bombing had failed to document an evidentiary chain of custody, and thus reviewers could not determine the work performed or the reliability of the results in the reports of the case. Ron Woods, former defense attorney for Terry Nichols, later told me there was evidence that there was someone else in the Dreamland Motel with McVeigh when he ordered Chinese food delivery. The government never went in and fingerprinted or dusted for fingerprints or anybody. Jones' team attorney, Christopher Tridico, was specifically tasked with gathering and analyzing all materials during the trial preparation and court arguments concerning the forensic aspects of the case, who discussed the crime lab scandal with me. Quote, "What we learned about the crime lab through the Inspector General report was that it was poorly managed. The FBI had an incentive system for scientists there. If they testified in a case that resulted in a conviction, they got bonuses, which in our view was highly unethical. They had no scientific protocols to speak of. It was just pathetic. This was supposed to be the world's premier lab. They wanted convictions, and the FBI crime lab was suffering from a prosecutorial mentality. The judge would not allow any of this into evidence. At Elliott's body shop where the rider had been rented, the FBI had gone in and took the counter. They just unbolted it from the ground and took the whole counter and took it back to the FBI crime lab to fingerprint it, and they didn't find any prints on it. Another thing that surprised me was the head of the lab at the time, Stephen Burmeister, made a decision to mix the Oklahoma City evidence with that of the Unabomber case on a plane heading to Washington. They mixed the evidence in the same plane, and it made an FBI agent, Burmeister, admit that on the stand." Okay. Well, Match did not allow Whitehurst to testify about the crime lab failures in a limited capacity, or he did allow him to testify to the crime lab failures in a limited capacity during McVeigh's criminal trial. The majority of his complaints about the lab, as well as large portions of the Inspector General's final report, which called into questions the prosecution's theories about the chemical composition of the bomb, will be barred from entry as evidence. FBI agent John Hursley testified about traces of a detonation chemical called PDTN found on McVeigh's clothing at the time of the arrest. Whitehurst, however, who conducted tests on McVeigh's clothes, said he did not find PDTN residue on either McVeigh's clothes or in his car, the same conclusion reached by the Inspector General report. Prosecutors relied on receipts for the purchase of ammonium nitrate, said to be the main ingredient in the bomb, which had been found in Terry Nichols' possession, to establish a physical connection between McVeigh and the bomb. The only evidence that suggested the bomb contained ammonium nitrate was residual crystals discovered a month after the explosion. Whitehurst, in turn, argued that the heavy rain in the preceding month would have washed the crystals away. Joan argued that if Tim McVeigh built the bomb, the FBI would have found proof of it in his fingernails, nostrils, hair, clothes, cars, shoes, socks, but they didn't. They did not. In fact, beyond its ingredients, prosecutors did not bring up the actual building of the bomb at Geary Lake, and jurors never learned about many other forensic anomalies or inexplicable contradictions, including the fact that the storage lockers the government claimed McVeigh stored bomb components in bore no trace of explosive chemicals. Jones, describing the trial, wrote that the FBI had to stretch the evidence to prove that McVeigh was John Doe 1, and ultimately they could not prove McVeigh had ever even entered Elliott's rider rental shop at all. Okay. The three most damning witnesses called by the prosecution were McVeigh's sister and confidant Jennifer McVeigh and his friends Michael and Lori Fortier. After being placed under extreme duress by the FBI and the urging of McVeigh himself, Jennifer reluctantly agreed to testify against her brother in what Stuart Wright called the cruelest of ironies, offered what he felt was perhaps the most damning of all those who took the stand. Her testimony, as well as the many letters he wrote her in the years leading to the bombing, established his obsession with the Turner Diaries, his predilection towards right-wing ideologies and evolving hatred for the government. It did not connect him in any material or significant way to the bombing itself. Although at first Michael Fortier denied any knowledge or involvement with the plot to bomb the Murrah, he eventually confessed to having had prior knowledge about McVeigh's plans, not taking him seriously and failing to warn the authorities. In exchange for immunity for Lori, a reduced sentence for himself, and the placement of both in the witness protection program after 40 served the sentence, the 40ers agreed to testify against both McVeigh and Terry Nichols. During her testimony, Lori recalled that months before the bombing, McVeigh had come to her house and used 15 soup cans to demonstrate how he might plan to construct the bomb. She also said that she had helped McVeigh hide blasting caps used to construct the bomb by placing them in a box and wrapping the box in Christmas paper. As soon as she heard about the bombing on television, said Lori, she immediately knew Tim had done it. McVeigh said that other attorneys on his legal team had prepared a list of 118 cross-examination questions for the 40ers, but instead of asking them, Jones asked irrelevant questions like why she had so many soup cans and rambled on aimlessly about inconsequential topics. Still, Jones got Lori to admit that she had lied to FBI agents as well as her parents and friends about her knowledge of the bombing plot until the government offered her husband an immunity deal. Michael Fortier told jurors after the events of Waco in 1993, McVeigh became very disturbed, angry, defensive, paranoid. Then in 1994, McVeigh wrote Fortier informing him that he, with Nichols' assistance, was planning on some kind of positive offensive action intended to avenge Waco. After this point, he began to confide various details about the preparations to Fortier, who then agreed to help. He admitted that he had accompanied McVeigh to a storage unit space where McVeigh had stashed stolen bomb-making materials and on one occasion to Oklahoma City to case the Murrah building. Under cross-examination, Fortier, like Lori, admitted to having made a number of contradictory and insensitive statements to friends, family members, and the FBI in the few days after the bombing. For instance, in addition to insisting that he had nothing to do with the murders in OKC, Fortier had told friends and family, if they call me as a witness, I'd sit there and pick my nose and flick it at the camera. In one conversation, which was being monitored by the FBI, he said, I've been thinking of trying to do those talk show circuits for a long time, coming up with some asinine story and getting my friends to go in with it. He said he could fabricate a story worthy of the Inquirer. A cool mill by selling the book or movie rights to it. Lori and Michael Fortier, said Jones, were like Tarzan and Jane. They swing from tree to tree, trying the government's case together. On May 28, 1997, the evening before closing arguments began, Jones wrote to McVeigh and told him that he was honored to have been part of the case and that no matter how the verdict turned out, he wanted him to know that every individual on the defense team had been committed to providing him with the very best defense possible. Anyway, he then attempted to comfort his client by telling him that although through his legal team, McVeigh had achieved at least some of what his original objectives for the trial. I think the message that you would want out is out. The government is in a state of confusion and embarrassment. The next day, the jury began deliberation. McVeigh said that throughout the entire trial, he had known his death sentence was inevitable, and therefore didn't waste any energy on nail-biting over the verdict or sentence. The other members of his legal team agreed. Christopher Tritico said there was no illusion that we were going to win the case because the evidence against McVeigh, while it is circumstantial, was strong. Roger Charles said that the arguments Jones had presented during the trial all conceded that his client would be found guilty. On June 2, 1997, after almost 24 hours of deliberation, the jury found 29-year-old Timothy McVeigh guilty of all 11 counts against him, recommended prosecutors seek his execution, and the sentencing phase of the trial began. McVeigh's parents took the stand, asking the court to spare their son from execution. His mother's statements brought what appeared to reporters to be a tear to her son's eyes. He is not a monster, she stated, choking back her own sobs. Yes, I am pleading for my son's life. He is a human being. His father, always the quiet type, chose instead to play with jurors' home videos showing McVeigh as a young, normal, all-American kid. McVeigh said he did not want his parents to have to beg for his life, as the jury had already made up its mind, and attempts to change them at this point in the game were farcical. On June 13, 1997, prior to receiving his sentence, McVeigh, for the first time throughout the proceedings, took the opportunity in court to speak on his own behalf. To quote the dissenting opinion of Judge Brandeis in a 1928 illegal wiretapping court case, this is what he said. Our government is the potent is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. Omnipresent. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Then the jury sentenced Timothy McVeigh to death by lethal injection. Despite the overwhelming relief of many, not everybody felt the trial had provided any real resolution. Georgetown University law professor Paul Rothstein remarked that Judge Match held the reins so tightly that maybe there will be some doubts throughout history as to whether there were stones left unturned. During a press conference on June 16th, Stephen Jones told reporters, "There is also a considerable body of evidence that indicates that he is not guilty." Now, the jury didn't find him not guilty, but the jury didn't hear the entire evidence. McVeigh, he continued, was not evil, and if the public knew the full story as he did, they would agree. When asked to explain, Jones said that he could not talk about what he knew, mainly because McVeigh wouldn't want me to, and then remarked that evidence existed which suggested the government had prior knowledge of the bombing. On June 30th, 1997, Stephen Jones wrote a letter to Mickey Frazier, McVeigh's mother. "I just wanted to tell you how sad I am for your family and for Tim that we did not have a better result," and expressed that Tim was tried and convicted in the court of public opinion even before I was appointed to defend him. He has so many good qualities, and that is why I have been careful to say in all my interviews that he is not evil or demonic, that he has many fine and noble qualities, not the least of which is empathy for the innocent. Jones's kind words and assurances failed to quell the hate McVeigh had developed for him. After his sentencing, McVeigh successfully this time filed a motion with the court to have Jones removed as his lead attorney. Several other members of the Jones team continued to represent him throughout appeals and his execution in June 2001. The federal trial of Terry Nichols began shortly after McVeigh's concluded. Prosecutors argued that Nichols had helped McVeigh compile components that the two of them built the bomb together. Nobody, however, including the FBI, suspected Nichols of being John Doe too. Nor did anybody assert that he had been in OKC the morning of the bombing. Curiously, Judge Match allowed Nichols' defense team to introduce some of the evidence about the John Does not allowed at the McVeigh trial, and testimony such as Carol Hose, the informant, which was barred during McVeigh's trial. Attorney Ron Woods explained to Nichols' attorneys were not hampered by the same evidentiary restrictions and exclusion rulings as McVeigh's, and this allowed them to present a great deal of information that Jones had hoped would not be allowed to be, was not allowed at present. Sorry, I'm doing a terrible job with this paragraph. Basically, the Nichols team was allowed to show stuff that the Jones defense team for McVeigh wasn't allowed to. At the very least, Woods said, this information sowed the seeds of reasonable doubt about the government's narrative in the mind of the jurors for Nichols. The jury in Nichols' case certainly had doubts. It was always our position that it was someone else with McVeigh, and we spent a lot of time presenting evidence that there was someone else with McVeigh that was not Nichols. But we could never find out who that was. The evidence from the witnesses indicated that there was someone else with McVeigh when he came to rent the Ryder truck. There were witnesses who saw the Ryder truck being driven down the streets of Oklahoma with 2 people in it. There were also several reports of a third person. The government had developed this information but didn't want to present it because it was inconsistent with their theory. Before dismissing the jury in Nichols' 1997 pre-sentencing hearing, the U.S. District Attorney Judge Richard P. Match, who had also presided over McVeigh's trial, stated for the record that not all of the questions have been answered and employed the FBI to continue their investigation into other unidentified conspirators. The jury deadlocked, so Nichols was not eligible for a death sentence. Ultimately, they found him guilty on 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, and he received a sentence of 161 years in prison without the possibility of parole. On May 27, 1998, Michael Fortier accepted a reduced sentence of 12 years in prison and a fine of $75,000. After his release from prison in January 2006, he and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program and given new identities. Get some of those. In 1999, after the Supreme Court rejected his appeal for a new trial, McVeigh chose to end his appeals. He removed Jones as his attorney and requested the earliest date for his execution, which was set for May 16, 2001. However, on May 1st, 2001, after the FBI disclosed that it had withheld thousands of discovery documents from McVeigh's defense team during the 1997 trial, Attorney General John Ashcroft, we know John Ashcroft, ordered a 30-day postponement of the execution to allow for attorneys to review the documents. This, however, was not enough time for his attorneys to adequately view the materials, and they had reason to believe that the documents represented only a small portion of what had been withheld during discovery. Nevertheless, Ashcroft insisted that none of the newly found documents created any doubt about McVeigh's guilt, and the execution would proceed. Randy Coyne said, "We were buried in FBI investigated reports known as 302s. We were given the haystacks and so set about looking for the needle. Apparently, as was revealed later, not everything that should have been turned over to us by the government was." Christopher Tritico recalls, and quote, "After the trial, I was off the case, but when the evidence came out that the government had not given us all of the evidence, I was reappointed with several other members of the original defense team and was his lawyer again until execution. When we found out about all of this evidence, Tim said, let's find out what it is at least, and authorized to do what we had to, and to try and stop the execution and see the evidence. And of course, we were denied at every step. The documents we did get gave us leads we wanted to investigate. Can I say these leads would have radically changed the outcome of the trial? No, I can't say, but those leads led us to discover that there was another 100 boxes of evidence that we never did get to see. Now, in that 100 boxes, is there something that would have changed the outcome? Who knows, and nobody ever will." The title of a May 12, 2001 New York Post article, "Dead Man Laughing. Tim the Terrorist Sneers at Victims," quoted one man whose 27-year-old daughter had died in the bombing and who, when asked his feelings about Tim's impending execution, said, "He is enjoying this attention because we have created a monster." The article concluded by stating that while new evidence was coming to light in the final hours before the execution, America's most homegrown monster was laughing when people are still crying. Dead man laughing. Still headlines like that of CBS News, which claimed evidence the FBI withheld on purpose, suggest prosecutors contradicted information FBI on hand, kept public doubt about the case alive. According to public opinion polls, specifically polls, by June 2001, nearly 2/3 of Americans thought other individuals beyond McVeigh and Nichols had been involved in the plot. 2 survivors of the bombing unsuccessfully petitioned the court to delay the execution for the sake of obtaining and preserving evidence of the crime. One of them, VZ Lawton, said, "I lost 58 friends in that building, and the bombers also attempted to murder me. I believe that is reason enough for me to pursue everyone who was involved in the bombing. I want justice, but there can be no justice without truth." While some hoped that if McVeigh was still alive, he might someday be able to tell the truth about the facts surrounding the bombing, the majority of those victimized believed that, even if there was more to the story, McVeigh would never talk. In any event, Timothy McVeigh seemed to have nothing more to say. Having considered the possibility of filing another appeal, he instructed his attorneys to drop any appeals and resigned himself to death. The Bureau of Prisons allowed the execution to be broadcast via closed-circuit television to victims' family members. 14,000 press credentials were issued, and on the morning of June 11, 2001, scores of reporters from media outlets and cable networks were gathered outside of the Terre Haute prison. At 7:14, after receiving a series of lethal injections, 33-year-old Timothy James McVeigh was pronounced dead, becoming the first federally executed prisoner since 1963. As his final statement, he offered the words of William Ernst Henley from his 1975, I'm going to do this correctly, William Ernst Henley's 1875 poem, Invictus. This is the last thing I'm doing, so I'm going to do a good job. From William Ernest Henley's 1875 poem, Invictus. "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged the punishment, the stroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Okay. So that was the first 59 pages of Abberation of the Heartland of the Real, Secret Lives of Timothy McVeigh. About the first 15, the prologue. That was the prologue. I have read this whole book, obviously not well enough to read it perfectly out loud, but I would like to do chapter 1 at some point, if people want to do that. Yeah, the chapters are shorter than the prologue, actually, but and I love this book. A lot more interesting, extremely interesting things are going to happen, and he is a very, very interesting character as an American informant, patsy, patriot, racist, white supremacist, villain, and also sort of, in a way, kind of like a little Ken doll that the Bush Senior administration created to play games, the American mind, the American fascist mind. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I have a meeting tonight, so I cannot stream tonight, but see you tomorrow maybe. Thanks whoever's watching. I'm very grateful.